Sì, ma qui ci vuole il campanone del Duomo, mica qua. Qui ci vuole. I professori chiamati a tenere le lezioni possono già salire.
Posso già salire?
Sì.
Ma guarda, devo fare il giro per le sue, perché la scala non è sicura.
Oh, ecco. Ecco.
Dobbiamo sederci subito tutti al palco?
Sì, siediti,
Sì, tutti.
perché noi incominciamo, puntuali. Guarda tu che mi hai portato Iella.
Io?
Sì.
Beh, bella fama mi stai. Grazie Giuseppe. Sempre un piacere vederti.
Sì.
Dunque, questa è la mia relazione, prego notare.
No, dai, sta davvero nei 45. Salta qualcosa. Qui guarda. Qui ci vogliono un'ora, ci vuole.
No.
Perché guarda, queste
No,
dunque,
guarda che ho fatto...
5 minuti.
Guarda che l'ho calcolata con l'orologio 3 volte.
5 minuti per pagina.
No, sono 3 minuti.
Professore, buongiorno.
Buongiorno, noi ci siamo conosciuti a Orvieto
Prego?
anni fa, ricorda? Ci siamo conosciuti a Orvieto anni fa, ricorda?
Sì,
Il convegno sul miracolo.
però sa... Volendo onorare la virtù della puntualità, incominciamo.
Good afternoon. Let's start with this speech by Professor Etienne Dublier from the University of Cologne, if I'm not wrong. Vidit Coloniam, not Vidit Germaniam. The title is Declinations of Royal and Imperial Authority, North and South of the Alps, between social spaces and regional spaces. We are on time, so please, professors, be on time as well. So you have 45 minutes. Thank you very much, Professor Cremascoli, for the introduction, and I would like to thank the organization also of the Settimana for inviting me. I really appreciated your invitation. Please take your seat.
Forse può incominciare, professore.
Incomincio.
Okay, I will start now. Speculate, reflect. Every thinking activity implies mirrors for me. According to Plotinus, the soul is a mirror that creates material things reflecting the ideas of the higher reason. Maybe this is why I need mirrors to think. I cannot concentrate except in the presence of reflected images. as if my soul needed a model to imitate every time I wanted to employ its speculative capacity. Distinguished colleagues, I hope that the choice to begin a lecture on royal authority in the 11th century with a quotation from a 1979 work by Italo Calvino will not be regarded by you as a superfluous virtuosity. In the 7th of the 11 short stories that the two readers, the protagonist of If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, are from time to time forced to interrupt, the incipit just quoted introduces the story of a Japanese businessman obsessed with refraction, to the point that he has arranged for the construction of a dwelling consisting entirely of mirrors designed to make him at once present and fleeting, elusive even to himself. In addition to representing a small celebration of a great scholar and intellectual fascinated by the Middle Ages whose birth centennial currently falls, the quotation is intended to draw attention to a paradoxical aspect of royal authority in the period of our interest. Of all the profiles of the 11th century, the royal imperial one is certainly the most persistently present in the sources, and is probably also the most widely studied by modern historiography. Nevertheless, despite the repetitiveness of the intitulaciones and arengue of the diplomas, the dating of the documents, the analytic annotations, or perhaps precisely because of it, this profile is on closer inspection the most rarefied, the least defined, if by definedness we mean a clear direction, what we are wont to call, with too much nonchalance, a policy. And the need, it would come to say the anxiety of a part of modern historiography to give definition to this profile, to identify at any cost a royal policy, well appears with that of the individuals and communities of the 11th century. Actors interested in bending the kingdom and the royal authority, these extraordinary military but also symbolic resources, to their own short, medium, and long-term needs. At the level of the exercise of power, historical medieval research has long diagnosed a paradigm shift that would take place at the beginning of the 12th century. In The King's Two Bodies, Ernst Kantorowicz postulated in 1957 the transition from a Christ-centered kingship to a law-centered kingship, typical of the 12th and 13th century. In its basic features, this conception has been taken up in numerous syntheses by, among others, Jacques Le Goff, who noted the transition from the type of the anointed, hence messianic ruler, to the administrative ruler, and Stefan Weinfurter, who, resorting to the Weberian category of disenchantment of the word, Entzaubberung der Welt, noted a necessary resynchronization of royal authority desacralized by the conflict between regnum and sacerdotium. In diagnosing an acceleration, if not an actual caesura, in the process of transforming the exercise of royal authority, historiography has frequently made use of characterizations that already at the lexical level trespass into the sphere of value judgments. The tripartition of the Middle Ages, typical of German research, contemplates between the early and the late Middle Ages, and Middle Ages that are not central but elevated, auch Mittelalter precisely. The latter, in the classic synthesis of Giesebrecht, a fundamental and formative text for the educated bourgeoisie of the Wilhelminian era, came to coincide with the Kaiserzeits, the imperial epoch, the apex of which was undoubtedly the rule of Henry III, which was followed by a phase of decline in which Germany, so to say Germany, would lose a train of history. Interestingly, in a changed cultural paradigm in which centralist, top-down and national structures are viewed with suspicion, what was once considered a manifestation of decline can be re-evaluated in terms of its affinity with today's political culture. I refer to the concept coined by Bert Schnellmuder of consensuale Herrschaft, consensual exercise of power. This is one example among many of the reconsideration of 11th century transformation carried out by German medievalism over the past 40 years. A reconsideration that has allowed it to leave behind an unwieldy past, but which can also be explained in the light of the limited reception, limited compared to other European historiographies, particularly Italian and French, of Vetero-Marxist paradigm, and the wide appreciation of cultural history approaches borrowed from the social sciences. The change of pace that occurred in the 1980s is evident when comparing the positions expressed by two leading German historians on aspects certainly not identical, inherent in the exercise of royal authority, but not too distant either. In a celebrated 1969 article on the locations of judicial tribunals in the Italic kingdom, Hagen Keller noted that with the dismemberment of the fiscal estate and the ceding of royal rights to bishoprics and a feudal aristocracy, the kings of the 11th century were left with only the establishment of prelates as a possibility of influencing Italian context. This reduced the sovereign to a de facto external actor structurally destined to be instrumentalized in the context of conflicts to the genesis of which he was a stranger. In his equally famous study of Transalpine communication, published in 2003, Wolfgang Guscher judged the contribution of figures of Italic origin to the holding of royal authority both north and south of the Alps to be considerable. Subalpine scribes, many of whom held episcopal offices, would have operated at the royal court as dictators and notaries of diplomas, implementing a constant liaison between the sovereign and local societies. Italian historiography, despite its early and extraordinary lucidity, also as a result of long-standing cultural conditioning, has struggled and still struggles to accept the possibility that in the face of an objective loss of power in the Weberian sense of Macht, royal authority could continue to represent an interesting object of historiographical investigation. And the result is that in relation to the second half of the 11th century and the first half of the 12th, sovereigns often end up in the background of major reconstructions of political and institutional history. Paolo Camarosano's great synthesis of political Italy in the early Middle Ages closes with the following remarks, and I quote: "What manifested itself with the Ottonians was not an absolute crumbling of royal power, but a gap which would never again be bridged between the structure and dynamics of royal politics and the structure and dynamics of powers in the Italian territories. In the 11th century, this distance would be accentuated. The mediation between crown and subjects, which had been identified in the Ottonian age in a rarefied elite of bishops and marquises, would prove less and less proposable." End of quotation. With the end of the conditioning power of the king, the early Italian Middle Ages ended, and the era we usually call the age of communal civilization and local powers began. An important manual such as Luigi Provero's speaks, not surprisingly, already in the title of Italy of Local Powers. Even in Giovanni Tabacco's reconstructions, the 11th century is characterized by a very deep crisis of the kingdom, to which, however, the historian from Turin recognizes the possibility of regeneration from the outside. And I quote: "It is to him that the kingdom, which had long been subjected to profound reductions and transformation by forces that had grown in its shadow, was shaken by a violent crisis in which all problems became urgent and everything became possible, both the exauthorization of the kingdom and its transformation. The forces that seemed to overwhelm him were still very far in Italy from considering it superfluous, and thus provoked a debate that, born under the sign of ecclesiastical reform, opened up to broader perspectives than ecclesiological ones in a horizon of civil life in which political power was being asked to redefine and restructure itself." End of a quotation. Partly similar Partly different considerations had been made by Chris Wickham, who in several places has identified the collapse of royal administrative structures and practices, among which he especially emphasizes the placitum as the prerequisite for the decisive emergence of structures with a low level of institutionalization, such as city autonomies and rural lordships. Similar to what Gioacchino Volpe postulated more than a century ago, there would not, however, have been any awareness in them of constituting, to some extent, a continuation of a public order. The king would have continued to be occasionally involved in and instrumentalized by local forces. The kingdom would have continued to exist in the imaginations of jurists, but of an effective governance of the kingdom one could no longer speak from the late 11th century onward. The aforementioned analysis of the crisis of transformation of royal authority in Italy, and to some extent in Germany as well, when compared with another strand of scholarship, that of the history of ecclesiastical institutions, in which there is a tendency to emphasize instead the king's enduring ability to influence local contexts, albeit through the eminent medium of bishops. In his very useful repertory, Gerhard Schwarz wrote that in the 11th century, the bishops of this Gallic kingdom bled themselves dry in the service of their kings. While Ovidio Capitani, in the third chapter of his 1966 Immunità Vescovili about Henry III and the bishops, had defined the emperor as more object than subject of political initiative. Much more recent studies, and I'm referring especially to Glauco Maria Cantanella and Nicolangelo da Cunto, have insisted on the systemic character of the collaboration between bishops and sovereigns, in some cases bringing back into vogue the category strongly relativized by Timothy Reuter and Stefan Paspo of the system of the imperial church. The disorientation that may arise from what has been noted so far could, in my opinion, be remedied by renouncing at least some of the only seemingly indispensable dichotomies, such as strong power and weak power, central power and local power, public power and seigneurial power, and instead taking as a starting perspective a range of social and regional spaces with their capacity to decline and condition royal and imperial authority. By social and regional spaces, I mean formations that are not necessarily institutionalized and not always unambiguously perimeterable, but nonetheless bearers of a political culture within which functions are attributed to the king and royal authority, as well as to public, hence royal, metrics, symbology, and terminology, also on the basis of a more or less deep-rooted historical and social knowledge. These social and regional, sometimes overlapping spaces, and I'm thinking of urban communities of greater tradition, the bishops of a region, the class of notaries and judges, aristocratic king groups, communities of arimanni, ducal and marquis domus, are not just local powers to be opposed or juxtaposed with central power, but active parts in the definition and construction of royal authority. If this is true, one would have to ask to what extent it is appropriate in our reconstructions to contrast at the terminological level local forces in the one hand and a phantom kingdom or empire on the other, as if territorially entrenched actors did not consider the kingdom as a horizon or political space of reference. A similar concept, that of Orkunust configuration, was used by Stefan Weinsfurter about the Henry III years and critically discussed by a Reichenau conference whose proceedings were published in 2006. Setting aside the purely governmental administrative perspective and blurring the dichotomous categories mentioned above, as pars pro toto, public and private regal authority can acquire both in relation to German and Italian regions a new relevance, provided that it is considered not only a force but also a resource in the availability of a plurality of actors. And the fact that in the lowest centuries there was no development in the monarchical and proto-state sense should not distract from the prominence that these reserves had for longer or shorter phases in numerous social and regional spaces. In this way, we're not far from the possibility of renewal that Giovanni Tabacco wrote about, a possibility of renewal, in my opinion, also as a historiographical object. It is a weakly, figurational approach. The reference is to Norbert Elias, The Society of Individuals, that has, in my opinion, borne excellent results in Alessio Fiore's research on the rural areas of the Marche region, where, as a result of a peculiar convergence in the forms of territorial domination in the 12th century, the empire with its representatives, thus a power we call public, is what comes closest to a seigneurial power, thus a power we could call private. In order for this proposal not to turn into yet another static model, only moderately capable of enhancing the diachronic dimension in addition to the synchronic one, it is appropriate not only to photograph dynamics and mechanisms of operation, but to focus on the evolution experienced by these mechanisms by virtue of the interaction between different political cultures in a hermeneutic framework, between contexts and processes. It is not, in other words, a matter of trivially reducing royal authority to a projection surface of external actors, of noting that different conceptions of imperial authority existed, or that it was variously instrumentalized, but rather of posing the question of how such peculiar declinations were grafted onto a process of transformation of royal authority, conditioning it. This is what I'm about to do by focusing on two paradigmatic themes for the changes of the 11th century, that of the personhood or transpersonality of royal power and that of the sovereign's participation in urban conflicts. The hope is to intercept through these two thematic strands a plurality of aspects, which will also emerge in other lectures this week, but which also constitute terrains on which European historiographies are traditionally prone to confront each other, and which bring our specificities at the level of approaches, terms, and interpretations. Talking about personhood or transpersonality and conflict makes it inevitable to raise questions of the relationship to space or territory, to old and new social groups, and to the reasons for and implications of consent and dissent. My considerations take their starting point from a source as well known as it is controversial, the Instituta Regalia et Ministeria Camere Regum Langobardorum, inserted within the 14th century Honoratiae Civitatis Papiae, itself betrayed by an early 15th century manuscript. The short text, which according to Arrigo Solmi dates to the years between 1010 and 1020, and which Carle Brul and Cinzio Volante have with good arguments dated to 1026 or 27, offers a kind of history of the royal chamber of Pavia from the years of King Hugh until those of Henry II, and a list of the tributes and benefits payable to the royal chamberlain. These include also those that merchants and pilgrims were to pay at the Alpine tall stations mentioned here one by one, those of merchants from Venice, Salerno, Gaeta, and Amalfi, those of representatives of the Pavia merchants, the Monetari of Pavia and Milan, as well as fishermen, gold diggers, and riverboat owners. The Instituta constitute not so much a snapshot of the workings of the kingdom's administration, whose irremediable dissolution of compiler Gisulf nostalgically laments, nor it seems to me a vindication, but rather an apologetic memorandum from a descendant of the Camerari of the second half of the 10th century, which was likely compromised with the Ordwin faction. At the same time, the text gave us back the idea, the possibility of an administration of the kingdom, certainly an emanation of royal authority, but largely autonomous from it. The royal authority is here declining transpersonal terms, as it is mainly guaranteed by institutes and offices. It is at the same time declining territorial terms, since, as indeed already in the Pacta stipulated by the Ottonians with the Doges of Venice, there is a clear awareness of the cities and areas subject to it. The burning of a palatium in the year 1004 and its destruction in 1024 may not be so much to be interpreted as acts directed against the sovereign, but rather against the practice of tax exactions, which found applications especially in Pavia as a result of the survival of a class of administrators who, while referring to the king of the kingdom, acted, in fact, largely autonomously from them. At least until the 1170s, the transpersonal idea of royal authority documented by the Instituta seems, in fact, to underlie the political actions of numerous actors in the Italic kingdom, who, making extensive use of the public terminology and symbology, implicitly present themselves not so much as royal officials, but rather as the supporting axis of an order oriented to the king, but potentially existing and functioning even without the presence of the sovereign. The highest expression of this political culture is the practice of the placiti. The fact that in some Italian regions up to the last decades of the 11th century, judicial sessions in the form of the placitum publicum continue to be held with some regularity. The phenomenon was described and studied by Keller, Bugard, and Wickham. It is not so much the result of the smooth functioning of a supposed administration of the realm, but the product of the need for legal protection and social stabilization of a part of local societies through an instrument legitimized by tradition. At the same time, we are dealing with the precipitate of, again, tendentially oligarchic political culture that, inspired by the royal court and partly reproducing its dynamics, found in the episcopal, ducal, and marquis curious the chambers of compensation for local tensions and conflicts. This is not to return to the issue debated by Cesare Manaresi and Guido Mengozzi of the apparent or non-apparent character of the processes, but to point out that what was presented as royal was actually the result of the interest and habit of local elites to indirectly declare the kingdom as their political horizon of reference. From this point of view, in the late 11th century, there was not so much a collapse of the administration of the realm as a change in the dominant political culture and a widespread waning of the propensity of political military elites to conform to practices, terminologies, and symbologies that had their metrics in the realm.
What takes place is not a revolution, but to borrow from Dominique Berthelemy, a revelation of the self-gestational, partly fictional character of the previous phase. As culture and political languages change, Alessio Fiore has called this seigneurial change, the attitude of characterizing royal authority in transpersonal terms also begins to falter at the end of the 11th century. A clue to this is the titling of judges and notaries. In the years when Henry IV was opposed as king by his son Conrad, a part of the judges and notaries operating in Milan, where in any case there was a deep-rooted tradition of judges with mystic expertise, abandoned the titling of iudex et notarius sacri palati, and the sacred palace expressed more than any other place the transpersonality of the kingdom, and began to qualify as Iudex Domini Henrici Imperatoris or Iudex Domini Conradi Regis. The circumstance was alluded to in the well-known articles on Milanese justice by Antonio Padoa-Schioppa. Although the title of Iudex or Notarius Domini Regis Imperatoris was, especially in Tuscany, widely spread since the 10th century, it was only around 1100 that the link with the person of the king began to become dirimente. And this was precisely in Milan, where around 1075 the historiographer Arnulf was still expressing a fully transpersonal conception of royal authority by claiming the representative function of the proteras of the realm. It is not possible for me to follow the further development of this practice, which even outside the group of judges and notaries will be enriched with elements of sworn and personal allegiance and will know a new acceleration in the years of Coran III. We are probably dealing with a sedimentation in the case of judges and notaries with an institutionalization of practices that had gained relevance in the phase that Michelangelo da Cunto had characterized as the age of obedience and Thomas Cole in an attempt to overcome the terminologically misleading concept of struggle for investiture and the anachronistic concept of civil wars, schismatische Zeitalter, age of schisms. If we turn our gaze to the Teutonic Kingdom, we observe a process of different sign. It is the episode of the destruction of the Palace of Pavia that serves Wipo, court chaplain and author of the Gesta Conradi, a paraenetic text intended for the young Henry III, to take up the theme already dealt with in early chapters of the persistence of the kingdom in phases of dynastic turnover. Perhaps not without resorting to the rhetorical figures of paradox and irony, Wipo attributes to the delegation of Pavisans presented at Constance on Pentecost 1025 a speech innervated with Germanic and Privatist elements, and its sovereign a speech with Romanist and publicist overtones. Who did we offend? We served our emperor loyalty and honor until the end of his life. We cannot be blamed for destroying the king's palace when he was dead and there was no king over us. The Pavisians are made to say, and to Conrad, Sir experit, regnum remansit, sicut navis remanet, cuius gubernator cadit. As already mentioned at several points in the work, the kingdom without a king is compared by Wipo boat to a boat that falters but does not sink, and to an organism that is vulnerable but not dying. The boat is led by the gubernatores and the pontifices. The body sustains itself by its viscera, the great ones of the regnum and ecclesia. These passages from Wipo, studied by Helmut Beumann, are considered by German historiography to be the first indications of the emergence of a transpersonal conception of the kingdom among the Eastern Franks. This conception would have surfaced in the brief but intense interregnum phases of 1001 to 1024 and would have been consolidated in the minority years of Henry IV. Decisive, however, would have been the debates over the suitability of the king, the elections of Rudolf of Riffelden and Hermann of Salm in 1077-1080, and the deposition of Salik in 1104. The apex of this trend would be reached in 1121, when, as part of the negotiations that would lead to the Worms Concordat, the bishops, dukes, and marquises gathered in Würzburg made public their own concilium, in which they presented not two parties, regnum and sacerdotium, but three, Papa, Imperator, and Regnum, with the princes acting as representatives of the latter. The seemingly opposite outcomes noted about the Italic and Teutonic kingdoms also conceal, on closer inspection, common components. In both cases, the endpoint is a broad political space in which both competition between parties and competition with the king turn out to be structurally present. A political space in which the king is not necessarily a stabilizing factor, or at any rate may not be perceived as the main stabilizing factor. The issue of conflict allows me to move on to address the second thematic strand that I have chosen to use as a vantage point for observing the declinations of royal authority and their transformations, the participation of the sovereign in conflicts. The evidence from which to start is in this case the emergence, starting in the first decades of the 11th century, of a multiplicity of new actors, groups, and forces capable of inserting themselves in the political context, that is, in the competition for resources. I've already elsewhere resorted to the metaphor of the chessboard. I find it significant that Paolo Camarosano has given his already mentioned synthesis the title Nobles and Kings, Political Italy in the Early Middle Ages. Indeed, until the beginning of the 11th century, nobles and kings participated in a political context. One could integrate nobles, bishops, and kings, but in fact, it was a chessboard with few pawns, and as Gerd Althoff put it, with clear and established rules of the game. Again, Camarosano notes that for the first time in the history of the medieval West, around 1000, a dialectic began to manifest itself that was no longer limited to major churches, major aristocracies, and crowns, but complicated by the participation of collective movements to which it is difficult to attribute a promoter or leader. Observing the fundamental dynamics of the conflicts, in particular the functions attributed to the sovereign, we find in any case a constant that persists until the second half of the century, except in cases where the tumult is occasioned by the excesses of the royal troops, so in Ravenna in 1026, in Rome in 1027, in Parma in 1037, the king is not usually the target of the sedition. On Pavia in 1024, I've already expressed my reservations. Rather, he becomes involved in ongoing conflict by the holders of public matrix functions in an effort to restore the destabilized order. As uncertain as the outcomes of royal intervention may be, in Piacenza and Cremona in the tensions between bishops and the part of the Cives, in Milan in the clash between archbishops Capitani and Balbassores, those urging such intervention are mostly bishops committed to consolidating with royal support their lordship over the city and countryside. One exception is the communities of Ariemani, such as those in Ferrara, Montuagarda region, and Sacisia, traditionally placed under the protection of the sovereign. A plastic example of this fundamental dynamic is the so-called Pax Italica, which the editor Ludwig Philon dates to 1077, and in relation to which Ovidio Capitani, adducing decisive codicological arguments, proposed the date of 1046. This text carries the dictate of a 10-year sworn peace that includes a commitment to help King Henry and his representatives, bishops and counts, restore law and justice in relation to the alienation of ecclesiastical property, simony, and disputes related to praedia and beneficia. The context of elaboration and publication is synod, probably the one in Pavia in 1046, the content of the piece as well as the mode of transmission refer to a peculiar declination of royal authority with a stabilizing and restorative function typical of the first half of the 11th century. This is perhaps the mysterious start of restoration chosen by Capitani as the subtitle of the 1966 volume. The executors, and in a sense also the beneficiaries of the piece, are the holders of functions of public ascendancy, first and foremost the bishops, vectors, and advocates of an integral immune attitude, noted again by Capitani, and the subject of Caterina Ciccopiedi's lecture that we will hear tomorrow. As noted by Enrico Faini, a distinctive feature of Italian paci giurate is precisely their promotion by traditional office holders, in the first instance bishops, and their anchorage to public matrix order. This particular declination of royal authority was joined in the second half of the century by another, brought forward this time by those nameless and leaderless collectivities until then on the margins of the political agon. This is a phenomenon that takes on systemic dimensions, especially in the Teutonic Kingdom, and has been investigated especially by Gerold Bönnen. We owe to the monk Lambert of Ersfeld, writing around 1078, the first detailed accounts of the Worms and Cologne conflicts of a few years earlier. With reference to 1073, Lambert describes how Henry IV, ill and in military emergency, was welcomed with great pomp by chiefs of the city of Worms, who had expelled from the city the militants of the bishop who had escaped the capture attempt. An even more detailed description of the urban and extra-urban tensions is found in Lambert's account of the events in Cologne in 1074. After the celebration of Easter, Annon had the ship of a wealthy merchant seized. This provoked a great revolt against the archbishop, led by the Premiores and supported by the city population, who allegedly intended to do the king a favor and profit from it. Even before the revolt was suppressed, more than 600 mercatores reportedly managed to escape and go to the king, asking him to intervene against Annon. As unheard of as they appeared to the monk Lambert, those of 1073 and 74 were not isolated episodes, but were at the beginning of a long series of urban conflicts in which citizens expelled the bishop, the formal order of public functions over the city, and resorted to royal protection. In Germany, the assumption of an attitude not necessarily hostile, but even simply critical of the ruler by the bishop and city lord becomes for the Chives, beginning in the 1770, an opportunity to expel the prelate and part of his militia. In addition to Worms and Cologne, such episodes occur in Mainz, Speyer, Metz, Liège, Wurzburg, Passau, Constance, and Salzburg. It is a motion that is not exclusively instrumental and emancipatory, but also contemplates active forms of support for the ruler, such as housing and sustenance for the court and targeted military aid. Upon the election of Rudolf of Rheinfelden as King of the Romans, for example, the Chiefs of Worms and Mainz reacted with a conjuratio that included military aid to Henry IV. In the last days of the same emperor's life, 1106, the citizens of Cologne pledged an oath to militarily defend the city from the archbishops and new King Henry V by building a fortification. These were certainly personal ties to the ruler, but they tended to hypostatize in the sense of a citizen libertas guaranteed in perpetuity by royal authority and not by the individual king, emperor. In the case of Speyer, this bond is enriched with a dynastic and memorial dimension. Henry V's famous diploma of August 1111, we are dealing with a sort of culmination point of the trend that began in the 1170, granted present and future inhabitants of Speyer of any condition exemption from a particular tax benefit. The Boot Ale, which the Cinsuales owned to the institution to which they were contractually bound, and sanctioned the abolition of the whole series of tolls, which represented for the episcopal lordship the city. The initiative was aimed at procuring the salvation of the soul of Henry IV, whose burial in the cathedral had taken place a few days earlier. The inhabitants of Speyer and the canons of the cathedral were enjoined as a quid pro quo to celebrate with special devotion the liturgical anniversaries of the deceased emperor, accompanying them with great acts of charity. The concession was issued not by parchment document, but in the form of an inscription in gold letters, placed on the portal of the cathedral's western facade. In this way, the citizenry took the ownership of an initiative, the construction of the cathedral, which had taken off 70 years earlier and which had contributed so much to the urbanization of Speyer. The citizenry itself was taking such an initiative to extremes culturally, architecturally, and in terms of collective identity, contributing decisively to the cultural construction of a dynasty that after the difficult years of Henry IV might as well have remained unfinished. Dynamics such as those noted in relation to the regions of southern and western Germany are also found south of the Alps, albeit to a lesser extent. Famous are the cases cited by Tilman Struve, Gabriele Rossetti, Raffaele Favini, and Mauro Ronzani of the urban collectivities of Lucca, Pisa, and Mantua, privileged by Henry XIV and anti-Matildic. Although only rarely motivated by loyalty to the king, the prolongation of the situation of city vacants of schism is characteristic of numerous dioceses in northern Italy, and think of Cremona, Piacenza, Mantua, Reggio, Parma, Brescia, functional for the consolidation of the position of cathedral canons and urban collectivities. Significant is the case of Parma, where according to the accounts of Donizzone and the Vita Prima Sancti Bernardi, the Vallombrosan monk and Cardinal Bernardo de Uberti, whom Matilda and Paschal II were trying to install as bishop of the schismatic city, received in August 1104 a turbulent reception from a large part of the Parmesan people. According to Matilda's biographer, when during his homily on the Feast of the Assumption, the prelate took to speaking about the kingdom of heaven, those present felt that a critique of the earthly kingdom was implied. This resulted propter regem for the king's cause in an uproar, and the capture of Bernardo was released only through Matilda's intervention. The reasons for the less systemic dimension of the king's involvement in local or regional conflicts by urban collectivities lie in the position taken by most bishops in the context of the struggles of the second half of the 11th century. Far from being an expression of mere obedience and loyalty to the sovereign, the so to speak English and certainly anti-Gregorian orientation of most of the holders of episcopal dignity in the Italic kingdom can be traced back to a peculiar immunitarian declination of church and kingdom order, which pivoted on procedural autonomy from the apostolic see and the exercise of public matrix functions by royal concession. This direction of the bishops, as well as the firm framing of city notables in the episcopal curies, rarely gave occasion for communities to rise up against the bishop propter regem. This could only happen in eras of Matildic influence or where Matilda tried to intervene in episcopal elections, such as in Brescia in 1087 or Parma in 1104. Looking at the history of the March of Tuscia between the 10th and 11th centuries, as well as the Canossian dominions in the north of the Apennines, this dynamic had precedence. Think of the solicitations addressed to Henry III by the bishops and communities of Arimani from Reggio, Mantua, and Ferrara during the Second Italian expedition. It reached, however, from the 1970 onwards a qualitatively new stage because of the polarizing role meanwhile assumed by the Apostolic See and the general ideologization of conflicts. Comparing the Italic and Teutonic kingdoms, it seems to me that north of the Alps, the same factors that made possible the affirmation of a transpersonal conception of the kingdom, albeit with an oligarchic horizon, also favored regular involvement of the king in conflicts between urban collectivities and the nominal holders of city lordship. I refer in particular to the consolidation of powers with the regional vocation in constant interaction with the sovereign. South of the Alps, on the other hand, it was precisely the frequent physical absence of the king, the widespread character of the schisms of the late 11th century, and the limited presence of powers of a supra-local scale that facilitated the transition from a transpersonal declination of royal authority to a tendentially individual approach to it. We have come to the epilogue, and we return to Speyer in December 1115. The continuation of Eckhard of Orer's chronicle reports how Emperor Henry V celebrated the Nativity of the Lord surrounded by a very small handful of worshippers, while in Cologne an anti-regent diet was being celebrated with very wide participation of the princes who would shortly thereafter define the kingdom. The ruler was simply not alone. It was just that the game of mirrors, that is, the attribution of functions that had enabled royal authority to renew itself continuously, seemed at the moment no longer to work. In his atmosphere of unprecedented resignation, however, Henry V had been joined by a delegation of Matilda's vassals and loyalists, headed by Abbot Pontius of Cluny, who urged him to cross the Alps to take possession of the Comitisa's rich inheritance. Again, the continuator of Eckhart notes that to avoid scandal with the princes, scandala principum declinant, and accompanied by the queen and their donus, and removed near the pole. What to the anonymous Teutonic historiographer and to many contemporaries appeared a fight marks, in my opinion, the end of the long 11th century. The quotation is from Glauco Cantarella, in which the king, although within a significant process of erosion of material resources, Macht, had maintained his own dominant position, Herrschaft. By reason or very peculiar declinations of royal authority operated within different social and regional spaces. The real point of crisis, the years following Henry V's imperial coronation, is also the one in which, in a context of general disambiguation, a process of renewal again proposed to the king from the outside under the banner of the re-territorialization of power begins. Disambiguation because the structural ambiguity of post-Carolingian institutions on which tobacco insisted was losing density, at least as far as the definition of spaces, procedures, and competencies was concerned. Keller wrote in this regard about the process of Vereindeutigung that would manifest itself especially in the new juridicizing interpretations of investiture, renewal from the outside because the instruments with which the sovereign was being equipped were at least in part those with which, under the veneer of a public-minded terminology and symbology, local actors, bishops in the first place, then also secular lords, the famous allodialization of power had long appropriated re-territorialization because the great gap between the 11th and 12th century, even at the level of royal authority, seems to consist precisely of the different function and conception of land. I thank you for your attention.
Sai che siamo online?
Essendo il potere sempre
Being the power a great mystery, well, you documented its different features, and we thank you for that. So now we move on to the lecture by Professor Glauco Maria Cantarella from the University of Bologna, who, and the title of his lecture as a special touch. So the title is the following: The Iberian Peninsula in an Age of Transformation. Fragments of a discourse? Question mark. Well, we are waiting for the response.
Prima che metti cosa, non starò a dire, ma è una suggestione che mi è venuta stamattina sentendo Chris Wickham che diceva 50.
Thank you very much. Somebody was saying 51, 52 years. Well, now it's been 53 years for me, so it is terrible to think about it. The reading of any compendium of Peninsular medieval history, better the pages devoted to the period that elapsed roughly between the middle of the 11th century and the middle of the following century, offers readers, even the most informed, a historical scenario of extraordinary complexity. It is not easy to summarize a historical period that involved so many decisive changes that definitely marked the posterior configuration of Iberian societies. These phrases by Luis Carlos Amaral and Mario Jorge Barroca, 2020, draw the picture of the problem as best they could. The 11th century is a pivotal century for the Iberian Peninsula, the century in which everything changes. All the new perspectives open up and fade away, from the death of Al-Mansur, which led to the implosion of the Caliphate of Cordoba, to that of the not yet 15-year-old Sancho, the only male child of Alfonso VI and Isabella, whom I have named Isabella Zero as a bootade, or, if you will, provocatively, since even in distinguished historians who have preceded me here, such as Garcia de Cortázar, not even Sancho is mentioned, not even in passing, and only now is the trend changing. Yet much has been discussed by literary historians, starting with Menendez Pidal, and for that matter, a review of the Liber Regum spoke explicitly of Zaida, Isabella, and Sancho near the Ciudad Fronteriza of Toledo. also had an indirect consequence, the birth of the Kingdom of Portugal, a development of a trend that dated back to the 1790s, a growing divide between Galicia and Endredoro and Minho. This is a long century if we also want to consider the appearance of the Consejos and get up to the taking of Saragossa in 1118. First of all, a few words need to be spent on the meaning of Iberian Peninsula, which actually seems an excellent field of action for theoretical reflections of geographers in recent years. For if in geographical terms we can assume that the Pyrenean chain, and also refer to Al-Idrisi, the famous geographer of Roger II, who wrote in this period, had lived in the peninsula until at least 1115. We must remember that in historical and political terms, the Pyrenees did not constitute a fracture, but rather a hinge, as is well known, at least until the Battle of Muret in 1213, as it's normally the case with all mountain ranges in pre-modern times and before nation-states. The Pyrenees were not the separation of two areas, rather they seem. The valleys were the channels of communication between the two sides. Al-Idrisi gave the most definite, pure geographic representation of them, and nevertheless somewhat problematic for us. Triangular. In a roughly triangular form, it will still be represented in the mid-16th century in the tapestries intended to celebrate Charles V's expedition to Tunis, and going up from south to north, divided into by mountains, the region of Andalus, which the Greeks call Hispania, and Geridas Andalus, the side to the south beyond Mount Al-Sharat, is called Hispania, and that which lies on the side of the mountain to the north is called Castilla. The first part of the fifth climate contains the northern side of Al-Andalus. In it stand Veled Galicia, something of Castello, something of Veled Gascunia of the land of the Franks, and also Vel Portugal. Within it is Barcelona. And concluding the description of the first part of climate fifth, after talking about Barcelona, it crosses diagonally over present-day France and writes, all the towns of which we speak are in Gascony and are close to the mountain of the ports. Extensive Basque lands, even in the eyes of the Andalusians, Gascony in the height of the Middle Ages is seamless with Spain, at least according to narrative sources, which in any case are corroborated by linguistic analysis from the 60s, 70s of the 20th century, as Rasico mentioned in 2015. In some peripheral areas of northwestern Catalonia, language closely related to Basque was spoken, at least until the end of the 11th century. After all, for Geraldo Cambrense, Bayonne is the capital of the Basque country from which the Irish came. I will add that in auto de fe, held in Zaragoza in the early summer of 1585, hubo tanto número de penitenciados bearneses y moriscos que en muchos años no se había visto tan grande. As Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas wrote in 1606, this was an organic part of Spain.
Dimensione complicata.
Spain is a complicated dimension. To trace it, we must resign ourselves to following a real circumstantial paradigm. It is like a gallery of mirrors that refer the same image back to each other to better or unexpectedly delineate its contours. It cannot be represented except in terms of espace vital, or history of spheres, vital and lived space. It is in constant mutation, and not only because of a so-called reconquista and repoblación that also involve the renewal of fronteras, of changing needs, or the formation of a real center-periphery system, not to mention the figure of semiotic war or semiotic debate, with which 21 years ago, right here, Ruiz Domènech interpreted Iberian history, and yet in 2022, the multi-handed essay towards a trans-regional approach to early medieval Iberia did not go beyond the north of the Iberian Peninsula. I do not pretend to add anything to the magnificent and very detailed historical portrayal that Carlos de Ayala Martínez made of it in 2017 in an essay from which one cannot disregard if one wants to deal with the subject. But one cannot avoid premising some general outlines, just as we must learn to understand what Spain is at the heart of the Middle Ages. The Spain is Gansanderes that we are, and it is precisely Ayala Martínez's study to which the important concise historiographical overview of towards a transregional approach must be juxtaposed that renders exhaustive and impassioned testimony. There was Al-Andalus, whose space remained huge even after the implosion of the Caliphate and the loss of Toledo, and subject to subdue it through not lasting expansions in the decades of the Almoravid Empire. As the Alaya Martinez again writes, Alfonso VI no había tenido duda de considerar una suma de naciones. Hispania está muy lejos de ser un mero referente geográfico. Es una realidad que sobre perfiles culturales bien definidos y sentimientos identitarios presenta desde fechas tempranas un evidente contenido político. Ese contenido oscila de manera dialéctica entre una pretensión de unidad idealizada y una realidad constitutivamente plural. Los 5 reyes de España, of which the Catalan chronicles of the 13th century speak, as Flos el Sábado de Curul and Luis Adao de Fonseca mentioned in a recent and very valuable joint work. In short, we are the origin of the pluriterritoriality of the modern age. Historiography has always paid more attention to aspects of institutional and political history than to those of economic history. I will make a few references later. And in my quick overview, I will not see things from the perspective of Al-Andalus, nor of the Trans-Pyrenean projections that take shape only in the 12th and 13th century. I will limit myself to a quick setup of a few key points. Tormented History of the Kingdom of Spain, El Reino que buscó su identidad, Molina Carrasco, 2018. Indeed, of Leon Castilla, the result of words subject to historiographical investigations that have a very long history, as is well known, and of deep critical insights in the post-Francoist age, and particularly in the last quarter century. Continually interrogated with restlessness, and it is not accident that García Cortázar in 1929 took up Ortega y Gasset, Lxxi, España Invertebrada, and continually revisited. Characterized by a plurality of kingdoms forming, joining, separating, reuniting again. Complicated from the very beginning. This is also well known, but I will allow myself to summarize it in broad strokes. You have to go back a long way. The origin of everything is Galicia, as it is known, the time of the dynasty of Oviedo and the kingdom of Asturias. The same family managed to enthrone kings and one after another. After the mythical days of Covadonga, the Muslims of Al-Andalus did not try to force the mountains. In 929, Al-Bahram was Khalifa Rasulallah of the new autonomous Caliphate of Cordoba. Then the Asturian things no longer sat in Oviedo but in León, transfer desire open on the Meseta, transfer desired by Alfonso III, who thus became King of León and to the royal title at the death of Emperor, which of course was not meant in a competitive sense with the Carolingian Empire, but meant holder in supreme place of superior power, was an indication of a dignity that surpassed all others, of a power that towered above all others, and resulted from the encomiastic commitment of the ecclesiastical holders of the written word and ancient culture. After all, Moregato had already been called Rex Regum, which made sense only in reference to the regional reality and its political and military protagonists. And Alfonso III united the kingdoms of Galicia, Asturias, and León upon himself. Then Ordoño III had pledged to pay a tax to the Caliph, but after Alfonso V was able to regain control. Upon the death of Al-Mansur, the Caliphate exploded. Some 30 years of inter-party fighting, the fitna, until in 1031 the notables of Cordoba decided that they would have no Caliph, and from then on each major center claimed its autonomy. This was the Spain of the kingdoms of Taifa party, we pronounced, though not exclusive and decisive, ethnic social characterizations. Taifas, Slavonic, Berber, Arab, each rich and prosperous, each reveling the other, all paying heavy tribute in gold parias to secure some peace of mind from the ruinous incursions of the offensive Leonians. The roles had reversed. The kingdom of León was consolidated. In 1028, Alfonso V died in Viseu, far from Leon. The succession is quiet. His son Bermudo III, the Minor, becomes king under the de facto guardianships of his stepmother Urraca, sister of Sancho III, El Major, king of Pamplona. It triggers the interplay of the network of family relationships that has been entrenched for centuries. Sister of Bermudo, Doña Sancia, was married to Garcia, Infante of Castile. And Garcia was brother of Doña Mayor, wife of Sancho III. But Garcia was assassinated, possibly by an Alava family who, albeit for 80 years, thus settled accounts with Fernan Gonzalez, had left no heirs. Bermudo III and Sancho III each claimed Castile for themselves as brothers-in-law, mirroring and always by female means of the deceased Infante. Sancho did not wait. He named his son Ferdinand Count of Castilla and married him off to the widow Doña Sancia. La successione hereditaria femenina era una capacidad jurídica y un hecho aceptado. The situation seems to stalemate, albeit with a slight advantage for the king of Pamplona, where he died in 1035. He was succeeded by his son Garcia Sanchez IV, who supported Ferdinand. Then he defeated Bermudo III and appointed himself king of Leon and Castilla. At this point, the web of kinship enveloped the entire northern political geography, with the exception of Catalonia. Although Sancho III and the Count of Barcelona, Ramon Borrell, in 1016 had entered into a marriage alliance that for a decade had cast the shadow of the King of Pamplona over the Catalan counties as well. Then Ferdinand defeated and killed his brother Garcia Sanchez IV, which enabled him to establish a sort of protectorate of the Kingdom of Pamplona. Titular as it was of the largest and most populous kingdom in Christian Iberia, he proceeded to conquer Viseu and Coimbra, and an equal may have reached even Pier Damiani. The Kingdom of Pamplona, or rather Iruna, or rather the Navarreria, the oldest core of the city, is on the southern edge of a vast region that in the north reaches practically to the mouth of the Garonne, Bordeaux. It was D'Artagnan's Gascony and was Gascony until the French Revolution, the city founded by Pompey, Pompela Pompelo, which already in its name reveals its Basque identity. The Basque Iluiru indicates city, settlement, and which, unlike the ancient Demic Sinter north of the Ebro, with the exception of Calahorra, whose importance queda patente por su papel en la historia política de los Banu Qasi, continued to be an active center. After Charlemagne's death, the Banu Qazis had been invaluable to the Inigo and Jimeno in the extension of the Kingdom of Pamplona. In 922, Sancho I Garces had joined the Kingdom of Pamplona, the County of Aragon. In short, the Kingdom of Castilla-Leon, which we claim a dominant identity in future Spain, was born under the sign of the Basques. Aragon also becomes a kingdom almost simultaneously with the invention of the Kingdom of Leon Castilla, with Ramiro, bastard of Sancho III el Mayor, a small kingdom that for 40 years had to juggle between Moors, Castilla, Navarre, and the counts of Palas and Urgel. Thus, the family of Pamplonians had divided the control of the quadrant leading from the Pyrenees to Galicia and the Atlantic. Far be it from me to evoke the nationalization of the past of culturally fluid societies placed in frontier areas by plunging into anachronism. In the words of Santo Salazar in 2023, I merely represent the evidence. It is then the Camino de Santiago is consolidated, the itinerary leading to the tomb of St. James and his church, an itinerary already frequented, but one that the kings of Pamplona, Aragon, and Leon and Castillo garrisoned with frequent and repeated ecclesiastical and monastic foundations, potential stages of the past centers capable of controlling their territories and connecting under the sound of devotion. Now, we have Cluny that comes into play. Ferdinand I, at his death, divided the kingdom he had founded. 3 sons. To Sancho came to the kingdom of Castilla and the Parias of Saragossa. To Alfonso the kingdom of Leon and the Parias of Toledo. To Garcia the kingdom of Galicia with the territories of Partacuela and Coimbra and the Parias of Badajoz and Sevilla. And then the 2 daughters, Urraca and Elvira, were jointly allocated the usufruct of the royal monasteries of all the kingdoms and some cities. The division might have seemed fairly equitable, as it is the case of Galicia, prerogative more of the bishops of Compostela than of the king, Tierra de Santiago, since the 9th century. Together with the resources of the Badajoz and Sevilla, which were 2 small kingdoms of primary economic and strategic importance. And the daughters were not unprotected either, since from the infanzado they could count on the system of monasteries and in addition on cities of strategic importance. But it did not seem so to the brothers.
Especially to Sancho, the eldest son, who could lament the fact that Alfonso was left with the kingdom that carried with it the imperial title and an incoming tribute that was certainly more important than what he would hold. So Garcia, who at Pedroso had defeated the Count of Portugal, Nuno Menes, and laid the groundwork for the future fortunes of the Archiepiscopal See of Praga, was beaten by his coalicid brothers in May 1071 and found honorable asylum at Seville in early January 1072. Alfonso was defeated by Sancho at Colpejera and imprisoned in Burgos Castle. On January 12, Sancho was crowned King of Leon, but in Alfonso's favor intervened Alferez Pedranzuras, Urraca, the Archbishop of Pamplona, and the Abbot of Cluny first. He was transferred to Sahagún San Fangondo in Abbey, located in the Camino de Santiago, halfway between Burgos and Leon, newly founded by Doña Mayor, his grandmother, and which was under the jurisdiction of the 2 sisters. He escapes the custody of the monks, manages to put the old Meseta between himself and his brother, arrives in Toledo, welcomed with honor by Toledo, Muluk al-Mamun, himself a man of great and frustrated ambitions. Sancho is busy in the north. On October the 7th, is besieging Zamora, a strategic place linking Leon Castile, southern Galicia, northern Portugal, county of which Urraca is mistress. It is his alferez, Rodrigo Diaz, the mythical Cid Campeador, the knight to serve without prejudice Christians and Muslims according to his convenience. If he takes Zamora, he can end matters even with his energetic sister and reign over a coherent area dotted with strongholds answerable to him. But that day he dies. Cid's stories will tell of treacherous assassination. The way to the kingdom is clear. In 1072, Alfonso II is king of Castile, Leon, and Galicia. In February 1073, on the advice and with the support of Urraca, he summons Garcia for a meeting with a view to the future arrangement of the kingdom and has him imprisoned in a castle of Luna, where he will die in 1109. Alfonso VI's reign will last 37 years, and with it again everything will change, giving rise to a very long-lasting body that survived the new separation of 1157 and 1230. In 1076, the agreement with the King of Aragon allowed him to incorporar las tierras de la Rioja, that would so in 1085 it will conquer Toledo, annexing a territory estimated between 30,000 and 40,000 kilometers. That would immediately attract immigration from Galicia, Asturias, Leon, Castile, and even from beyond the Pyrenees, becoming the most powerful lord in the entire peninsula and remaining so despite repeated reverses in the face of Almoravids. Forced him to abandon most of the territories between the Tagus and the mountains of Toledo. In the 13th century, it will be celebrated in the Romance de Rey Alonso que ganó a Toledo. It will have many wives, concubines, and daughters, only one son by Isabella, who will be sent to die before the Almoravids in 1108. Catalonia, it is well known as different history, bounded towards the south and west by Tortosa and Lleida, La Uniana, which constituted the northeastern limit of Al-Andalus from the 10th century onward. The military impulses of counts, as well as the viscounts and ecclesiastical lords, variously related to the comital dynasty, the encastellation and the emergence of subordinate social groups such as the Castellans Cabellari, militares feudalization that is following Bonassi, the transformation of beneficium into allodium at gradually increasing prices, and the foundation of lineages swept away the vast cousinage of the potentes and the greatly expanded the initial spaces drawn by the communities of Carolingian origin. By the middle of the 11th century, the Counts of Barcelona were already at the top of a new feudal pyramid augmented by the gold of the parias. I recall the phenomenon of fiefs rentes, by which the Count acquired the allegiances of the lords of the castles, transforming them into feudal lords. The solidante relations, the fiefs soldes, around 1058, Count Ramon Berenguer systematically used the mechanism of the convenienza to establish his own system of power. In the 12th century, s'è passata una nuova unità denominada Catalunya. In 1126 came the estabilización de las fronteras comtales sabate. Long and schematic manualistic ride, but unavoidable in order to appreciate the extent of the transformation, indeed of the transformations of the Iberian Peninsula in whatever sense one understands it. Within its framework are the major themes of its history. As I've anticipated, I will try to summarize some trends in historiography, fragments of an Iberian discourse. The Reconquista had avoided, in brief, as it is known, it was not called that until 1758. Jesuit Father Esteban de Terreros, and the term began to be used in 1808 in connection with the Napoleonic invasion Antonio de Campanin, Centinela contra Francesas. From the 1840, it was employed with increasing frequency in the literary sphere. In 1860, it appeared in historiography. Antonio Cavallines, Historia General de España. In 1873, Eduardo Zamora Caballero wrote that in the Reconquista, La Guerra de Siete Siglos against Islam, beginning with the Battle of Covadonga, laid the origins of the nation. On the 8th centuries of the Reconquista, Francisco Cordero's prolusion to the Real Academia de la Historia, 1879. And it was consolidated, as is well known, indeed assumed as a principle of Hispanic identity after the disaster of 1898. By the intellectuals of the generation of 98, especially Menéndez Pidal and Sánchez Albornoz, the forerunner, Ángel Ganivet, who in 1919 spoke of Cruzada de Reconquista to recover to Castile the generatrix of Spain, its moral uprightness and exemplary role. It is equally well known that after the exhaustive and innovative research of Rio Saloma, 2011, everyone admits that it is not a medieval category but a modern one. However, on whether it is a useful and not a misleading category, the discussions are heated. And if I may be allowed a boutade, the expression I mentioned earlier by Ruiz Dominic can be adopted semiotic warfare, as fitting as ever since many use it for convenience, as is the case with the Lxxi Gregorian Reformation, but also out of new ideological conviction, the artificial label of Reconquista. La recuperación de la maestranza trasnochada y patriotera versión nacional católica de la Reconquista, Garcia San Juan, 2022. And many get around it by dealing rather with the Holy War and Crusade aspects, or, as the Ayala Martinez did in 2020, they declined the term in the plural Reconquistas, Neogotica, Carolingian, Hispanica, Pontificia. It will be inevitable to return to this point, and in the Perspectiva Islamica. It is that the identity of a nation continues to be at stake, because the Reconquista does not apply to the entire Iberian Peninsula, but only to Spain. Might it be the case to return to the more vague but essentially accurate category of ensanchamiento, Modesto La Fuente, 1851? Closely related to the Reconquista, indeed their direct consequences are the issue of población or repoblación around the Duero-Douro basin, debated for many decades, and the theme of the frontera, which invests the entire medieval age. It could be avanzada y vulnerable, as in the case of Santarém to garrison the southern frontier, or heavily fortified fortified like Avila and Toledo. The frontera was a border. It was fluid, subject to military and political variation and to prospects of expanding economic spaces. As Sonemar Field wrote in a general sense in 2015, la frontera se levanta come un concepto ambiguo cuyos límites son diáfanos. Escudero Manzano 2016 has made a careful, detailed and insightful analysis of the población-repoblación debate, the conclusion of which may closely recall García San Juan's position on the Reconquista. En la actualidad, erróneas o interesadas interpretaciones a partir de una historia construida ex profeso y con un marcado tinte legitimador ha dado pie a que sectores nacionalistas utilicen la figura de los primeros repobladores y colonizadores del noroeste peninsular para tergiversar una realidad histórica que case con su justificación ideológica. The present special emphasis has always been placed on the institutional theme. Analysis and discussions of the relationship between kings and aristocracies have been and continue to be very intense and with various accents, as in the rest of Europe. Feudalism and social variation in Leon Castile, the constitution of Infasois in the county of Portugal, with the almost consequent downward crushing to all of Europe, although perhaps later here, and in the second half of the century, la articulación completa de las relaciones feudo-vasallática, the formation of the caballeros villanos in Leon, Castilla, and militares in the Catalonia, the upper edge of the rusticos. Those allowed your stem raised economically, urbanizations, and the fueros, a topic of paramount importance in trying to assess the role the kings intended to exercise. The problem of cities in the peninsula of the Christians so different and differently studied than in Andalus. Fueros, top-down interventions or promotions and incentives to communities that nevertheless had to feel the king's presence. The case of the Fuero Real for Sahagún, 1085, a village that grew up around the monastery on the way to St. James of Compostela, is perhaps exemplary because we have the narrative of it in the Crónicas Anónimas, although we no longer possess them in Latin but in the Castilian version of the mid-13th century. The Fuero gives Sahagún important privileges, including the market. The abbey is the center of everything and the owner of the land, so it is only allowed to own houses, even nobles, but not vineyard and gardens upon payment of an annual census as conocimiento de señorío. The possible interpolations of the text do not deny, if anything, they emphasize that the abbot is the lord of the borough, an immune lord who does not even have to provide the man for the king's hueste. But the king intends to maintain a presence in the hamlet by activating the mechanism of protection control, but by allocating the abbey to the place of his own peril and through the Palatine complex with the Palatine Chapel, thus an autonomous liturgical activity dedicated to Saint Mary Magdalene, the meal, and the baths. This immune island is endowed with all the conditions to thrive, and it is what happens. Pero el corazón de los dichos burgueses comenzó a crecer y levantarse en soberbia, como muchas veces se acostumbra a los fijos de pequeño suelo y vil condición si tenga substancia de las cosas temporales. Here the root of the later experiment of political autonomy. What is clear and must be believed is that the simple platitude, the Burgenses, preceded the Fuero Real. They had settled along the pilgrimage route. They were not natives. The names of the signers of the 1096 agreement by which the abbot renounced the right of oven are all foreigners: Gastones, Bretones, Alemanes, Ingleses, Borgoñones, Normandos, Tolosanos, Provinciales y muchos otros negociadores de diversas naciones y extrañas lenguas. As Martínez Opeña wrote, el protagonismo del Camino de Santiago es un hecho sin paragón. Camino de peregrinación, el comercio ha estado asociado al el principio. The accuracy of the text is maximal because the chronicles are written according to the good rhetorical rules of communication. They convey information, and in the treatment of history, they teach what should or as in this case, should no longer be done. So they cannot lack on the level of informative detail because knowledge is operativity. These chronicles, in short, are especially valuable because they provide us with the context, or at least one of the contexts, in which to place the Fueros Reales. Intervention of the king, yes, but the king considered it strategic and where he considered it useful to eventually negotiate with the burgesses. It is difficult to recognize in this the model in which las ciudades las crea el Estado, according to Castillo and Salazar expression. Moreover, not even Compostela, el primer núcleo urbano medieval surgido en Galicia, had been born this way. The Fuero of 1019 had recognized and sanctioned the socio-economic and institutional transformation triggered by decades of artisans, merchants, and pilgrims. Sahagún leads us almost inevitably to address another issue that has little or nothing to do with the previous ones, but which has always been and continues to be relevant in historiographical debate, indeed in the certainties of historiography, the role of Cluny, and especially its most influential abbot, Hugh I, who was uncle of Alfonso VI's second wife, Constance of Burgundy, and fostered the seminal family entanglements of Ramon and Henry of Burgundy. The former married Urraca, daughter of Alfonso and Constance, around 1087. Later Teresa, illegitimate daughter of Alfonso VI. After all, the Iberian Peninsula was the backyard of Cluny since the long abbey of Odilon 994-1048, who had woven relationships of familiarity and fidelity with Sancho III and Ramiro I of Aragon and Leon Castile from 1058-1063, had become a full-fledged Cluniac province, from which until 1109 the abbey drew on roughly done accounts well over 3 quintals of gold. But in September 2017, a small treasure of 21 dinars from 1121-1131, each about 4 grams, came to light, suggesting that the influx of Spanish gold had not stopped completely after the death of Alfonso VI. A drugged economy, the Cluniac one, as George Duby clearly wrote in 1952. Let us not be surprised if after the end of the golden shower and when inflation began to collapse, it was forced to restructure itself in debt for decades. And in any case, Spain continued to be a Cluniac province, not only with the immediate successor of Duke First Pons de Meguer, but for much of the 12th century. It was not to a pater le bourgeois that in 1962 Americo Castro called Duke Napoleon. After all, he was indebted to a scholarly nationalist tradition that since the 17th century and more so since 1794, Jesuit Father Masdeo Espaniarabe had seen on the side of the Pyrenees the Cluniacs as the invader, and on the other side of the Pyrenees the Cluniacs as civilizers, vehicles of civilization capable of taking Spain out of its isolation, bearers of a premeditated plan of imperialistic expansion, as Patrick Henry and Carlos Reglero de la Fuente have made very clear. In both cases, as if the monks had been catapulted directly from Cluny and had not been organic to Iberian societies. Between 1073 and 1081, Alfonso VI donated several monasteries in the Kingdom of Leon to Cluny so that they could be transformed into priories. Sahagún, December 10, 79, January 1080, did not suffer the same fate. The monastery became part of the galaxy of abbeys, so numerous in the age of Hugh I. The role of Cluny continues to be so unquestionable that it is impossible to accept an evidence that emerged now 30 years ago. That it was not Pons de Meguer who served as papal legate in 1112, but the abbot of St. Michael of the Close. Unfortunately, the fact that Pons could be said to be Catalan was not taken into account. Cluny drags with it the theme of the Roman reform of the 11th century, which is in turn directly connected to the problems of the Toledo Primazia, a tormented problem that would go all the way to the beginning of the 13th century and Jiménez de Rada. Aquella historiografía que considera las palabras cluniacense y reformador como sinónimos. Cluny is given an almost totalizing role. Enright coined the epic expressions of Pan-Gregorianism and Pan-Clunism, and I cannot but agree with him, given the very recent case, 2021, of a research paper by Masnu Pradzebaba, followed by Martí Aureli Cardona, that we know as Martin Real, in which it does not hesitate to declare Pope Paschal II Mort de Cluny, after making him Catalan. More attention to the historiography on the subject, starting with Servatius' monograph, 1979, will not hurt the author nor his tutors. In India, the Cluniacense and reform seemingly inseparable. el eje Roma-Borgoña, el encuadramiento del reino de León y Castilla, cuyos agentes fueron de un lado los monjes cluniacenses y de otro el papado renovado por la reforma gregoriana, reforma romano-cluniacense. The Reformation. Iberian historiography attaches a great deal of importance to it because it sees in it the origins of the very close relations with the Roman papacy. Gregory VII's action, far from being contextualized and seen in a era studio, is considered very incisive. Only that of truly incisive, there was the replacement, more important, traumatic, but more for the religious and the practical consequences on the social groups of belonging and reference, or for the people of God, that I know of has never been asked. Of the Mozarabic cult, traces of which, however, survived until the mid-13th century, with many contracts in Aragon and Navarre, formalized in Leon Castile at the Council of Burgos, which continued to arouse opposition until the end of the century, but nothing more. The kings continued to appoint and invest the bishops, beginning with Bernard, Archbishop of Toledo, not to mention Diego Peláez, Bishop of Santiago. And no ecclesiastical authority ever protested the royal practice. Indeed, in the letters of Archbishop Raymond of Toledo, 1126-1151, secular and sacrilegious elections were those that went against the royal candidate. Alfonso VI, like Sancho Ramirez, King of Aragon, turned a deaf ear to the imperious demands of Gregory VII. The Cluniacs about whom it is finally beginning to be said not only that they did not identify with Gregorian action, but in fact not infrequently came into conflict with the Pope, and were not beloved too much, even by his successors, however much Urban II came precisely from Cluny. They always put up a tough resistance to Roman penetration in their very profitable backyard, beginning with the mediating role they attempted precisely for the transition to the Roman Rite. Gregory VII's wrath was impotent and gradually weaker. Only now are new and less ideological research beginning to appear, and which do not fit into the groove of even recent customary Iberian historiography, which continues to attribute precisely to the Franco-Pontifical influence, all'abrigo della Riforma Gregoriana, the formation, or at least a very robust reinforcement, of the carácter específicamente hispánico del proyecto imperial alfonsino. Cluny is associated with France, la reorientación filo-francesa de la Iglesia Jacobea, la implantación francesa en Compostela. There is still much to be done, beginning, for example, with the fact that in the 11th century one cannot speak of France if one means something that does not have to do with Paris and the northeast of the present hexagon. And since to Soutien, it is not worth mentioning that with the themes of institutional, political, and territorial history are evidently connected those of economic history. Although, as anticipated at the outset, the topic of economic history seems to my knowledge less frequented, or at least historiography never seems to have addressed it specifically for the 11th century except sporadically. The research of Martinez Opera 1998, which could be summarized in the formula definir, proteger y articular los mercados because of the great importance it attributes precisely to mercantile activities, or in more recent years following Guy Bois' mutation feudal paradigm and Pierre Bonassi's research in focusing on the market for agrarian surpluses that fed the cities, access to currency, financial transaction, or even more recently, demographic history, as with regard to the great mortality from the food crisis in Catalonia in 1093-1095. For Catalonia, the expansion of cultivation from the use of forest, wheat, vineyards, livestock farming has been emphasized for the 11th century. Seafaring activities seems to have been explored from the 12th century onward, and yet the projection into the Mediterranean must have matured much earlier, as Colavini recently pointed out about Pisa. A military enterprise such as that of Majorca, indeed the alliance with Pisa itself, and the 1127 agreements with Roger II did not come out of nowhere. In 1991-92, La de Quesada and Quintanilla launched a paradigm of research proposals that, in my opinion, despite more than 30 years have been passed, continues to be relevant. Central role to the fueros, rich as they are with clues about agrarian practices and skills, sales, markets, the activities of small and large towns, fishing and transport activities, the potential all to be exploited of the numerous cartulari, tumbos in Galicia, becerros in Castile, from which, for example, then see experience of civically and cases to important information from the century 12th. A survey like Barron's very recent one on normal England in the 11th, 12th century would be welcome, and also a survey of how the pariah's reign of gold affected economic trends, a drugged economy like the clinic economy, a pure and simple monetary history. In short, the circle closes, indeed it reopens, because research is evolving, fortunately, and proceeding in broad strides, and as long as there are scholars with critical awareness and willingness to subject acquired or established models to revision and scrutiny and to propose new issues, methodological approaches, new questions, answers, it will always be rich in the future. Yeah. Quotation. The only thing to be done in the meantime is to continue to discourse with the greatest intellectual sympathy of which we are capable. Americo Castro, 1955.
Sterminata erudizione, noi ci inchiniamo. Va bene? Adesso...
Wonderful lecture. So now we give ourselves 15 minutes of break and we resume for the last lecture and the questions and observations on the opening speech and the lectures of this afternoon. So I see you in 15 minutes.
Bristol, your university. Sì. Beniamino, your name.
Benjamin. Tedesco.
Bible name, Bible name. Per rispettare i tempi procediamo.
Let's go on immediately with the lecture by Professor Benjamin Paul from the University of Bristol. The title is Cultural Capital, Norman Monasteries as Centers of Import, Export and Exchange in the 11th century Europe. Please, you have the floor, Professor. Thank you. Thank you very much.
By thanking the organizers for kindly inviting me to speak at this wonderful conference in their wonderful city. I would also like to take a second to thank the interpreters and translators who are doing a marvelous job translating papers into various languages as we speak, which is all the more important, as I'm afraid I shall be talking to you not in your beautiful language, not even in my native language, but in the 21st century lingua franca, that is English. I shall begin. Today, the 11th century is widely regarded as a period of pervasive change facilitated by increased mobility and the migration of people, objects and ideas, a world in flux, or Welt im Wandel, to borrow an expression encountered frequently in scholarship. Within this fast-changing world, it is difficult to think of a group more mobile than that to whose members we refer collectively as a matter of convenience as Normans, Normanni, a term which, as Lisbeth van Houts and others have argued, belies the heterogeneous and multi-ethnic makeup of those living in, migrating from or to, or associated with the Duchy of Normandy in the north of France. Such terminological imprecision and ambiguity notwithstanding, the Normans in historical scholarship and increasingly in the wider popular consciousness have become associated so closely and intuitively with notions of migration and mobility that even some recent publications used the term Norman world as virtually synonymous with 11th century Latin Europe. Others, meanwhile, caution against views of the Normans as global entrepreneurs and strategic architects of an intricate network connecting the medieval world beyond borders from Scandinavia and the British Isles to southern Italy and Sicily, Iberia, northern Africa, Illyria and the Levant. Whether we subscribe to views that emphasize uniformity and connectivity or to those that foreground heterogeneity and fragmentation, there can be no real doubt that Norman immigration and expansion had a profound impact not only on the political and economic, but also on the religious cultures of 11th century Europe. Scholars studying religious landscapes under Norman influence, such as those of 11th century England and southern Italy, have frequently highlighted the role of bishoprics and monasteries as vehicles of political authority and secular lordship. Founded, refounded, reformed, and patronized by the Norman ruling classes and aspiring elites, these institutions and those in charge of them, many of them from Normandy and some with close kinship links to the comital, ducal, or royal families, became political agents, landlords, and property managers, as well as instruments of dynastic and aristocratic self-fashioning. They both produced and accumulated what Pierre Bourdieu refers to as economic and social capital, with the former converting directly into money or assets, and the latter comprising connections and obligations that offered social credit and status, and which, under certain conditions, could be converted into economic capital. My focus this evening, however, lies with the third form of capital distinguished by Bourdieu as related to, yet distinct from, social and economic capital, that which he calls cultural capital. In Bourdieu's taxonomy, such cultural capital can exist in three basic states. First, in the embodied state of preferences and dispositions through which individuals and communities orient themselves within their social environment, elsewhere referred to by Bourdieu as habitus. Second, in the objectified state of cultural products, such as books, artworks, and other goods that can be appropriated both materially, via economic capital, and symbolically. And third, in the institutionalized state of disembodied and officially accredited qualifications that outlast the biological lifespan of individuals. Medievalists are no strangers to Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital, of course. Contexts in which it has been applied fruitfully include both historical and literary studies, with subjects ranging from manuscript transmissions in the age of Chaucer, John Gower, and Charles d'Orléans, to the literary cultures of early medieval Ireland and Scandinavia, and the epistolary and epigraphic cultures of late antique Rome and Byzantium. In most cases, scholars have focused their attention, for perfectly understandable reasons, on studying the more tangible formats of cultural capital, specifically in its objectified state. In this paper, however, I would like to foreground cultural capital's least tangible format, the embodied state, by studying the import, export, and exchange, not just of people and objects, but also, and perhaps primarily, of habitus and custom between different Norman monasteries in the 11th century. The three case studies I have selected between them cover the primary areas of Norman activity and immigration in the Latin West, Normandy itself, England, and southern Italy, and each of them will serve to illustrate a different means by which cultural capital was produced and transmitted across geographical and chronological boundaries. The specific monasteries I will be discussing are ones to which I have dedicated a fair amount of research over the last decade, and bringing them into conversation is an opportunity to revisit my previous work with new perspectives. My first case study is located, you will be pleased to hear, in southern Italy, more specifically in central Calabria, where in the early 1060s, a community of Benedictine monks was founded in honor of the Virgin Mary, one of the Normans' most popular patron saints, on the site of an earlier but derelict church dedicated to Santa Femia that had followed the Greek Byzantine rather than the Latin rite. In the interest of simplicity, I shall be referring to this 11th century refoundation also as Santa Femia. Scholars traditionally have attributed Santa Femia's establishment to the strategic initiative and political acumen of Robert Guiscard, who just a few years earlier had been invested by Pope Nicholas II as Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily. Indeed, Santa Femia would not have been the only Latin church thus established in southern Italy by Robert and his younger brother Roger, the future Count of Sicily, though it would be one of the first and arguably the most important amongst these so-called Hauteville foundations. Other prominent examples include Mileto and Venosa, both of which were placed under the leadership of monks of Santa Femia between the 1060s and the 1080s. Until Venosa's rise to prominence as the Duke's favored monastic house and family mausoleum, Santa Femia acted as, and I quote, the center of Norman monasticism in southern Italy, to borrow Hubert Huben's expression. Whilst there is no reason to doubt that Santa Femia's foundation was enabled by Robert Guiscard's investment of economic and social capital in the form of land and privileges, which were conceded to its monks in perpetuity in return for certain obligations, the source of its cultural capital was likely a different one. To establish this source, we must briefly recapitulate the story of Santa Femia's foundation and then revisit the evidence of its foundational document, the Monastic Foundation Charter of 1062. As is well known, thanks primarily to the detailed, if not strictly speaking contemporary testimony of Audric Vitalis, as well as to a lesser degree to that of Geoffrey Malaterra and Amatus of Montecassino, Santa Femia's initial monastic community consisted exclusively of Norman immigrants under the leadership of Robert II de Grandmesnil. A son of Robert I de Grandmesnil and his wife, Hawisa of Girois, Robert's ancestry brought together two of the most powerful aristocratic families of 11th century Normandy, who, as a joint venture, founded Audric's home monastery of Saint-Évroult in the Pays d'Ouche in around 1050. Due to this illustrious pedigree, young Robert was afforded a knightly career in the service of Duke William II, the future conqueror of England. In his early 20s, Robert then became a monk at his family foundation of Saint-Évroult and promptly advanced to the rank of prior before succeeding the late Thierry as the community's second abbot in 1059, appointments that were no doubt helped by his close personal relationship with the Norman Duke, who, despite the custom of free abbatial election by the monks, reserved himself the fiercely guarded right to both approve and invest new abbots in monasteries throughout his duchy. This close affiliation between Duke William and his former knight-turned-abbot of Saint-Évroult was ruined just 2 years after Robert's abbatial appointment, when his own brother, Hugh de Grandmesnil, fell out with the Duke, and Robert, having fallen from grace along with the rest of his family, was removed from office in 1061 and exiled from Normandy. Together with 11 monks who, out of loyalty, had rejected his ducally appointed successor, Robert left for southern Italy in the company of other family members, including his half-sister Judith, who later that same year married Robert Guiscard's brother Roger. Having thus traded patronage from one duke to another, Robert de Grandmesnil and his followers were granted land in Robert Guiscard's recently conquered power base of Calabria, on which to build the new monastery, over which Robert would then preside as abbot for 20 years until his death in 1082. Santa Eufemia's foundation charter records in detail the possessions and privileges Robert Guiscard granted to Abbot Robert to be enjoyed by him and his successors freely and in perpetuity, just as the Duke himself had helped them freely and lawfully. Besides the grounds of the monastery itself and a substantial property portfolio of nearby fields, woodlands, rivers and ports, these include several churches and no fewer than 6 monasteries, one of them, St. Elia, an imperial one, with their respective tenants, dependencies and appurtenances. As Graham Loud has noted, and I quote, "The foundation and endowment of monasteries was something expected of a ruler like Robert Guiscard as a necessary part of his bella figura. And it has thus been assumed that the southern Italian Hauteville foundations, Santa Eufemia included, must have, and I quote again, reflected the wishes of their ducal founders." This assumption requires considerable nuancing, however, certainly with regard to Santa Eufemia. Upon closer inspection, the monastery's lead architect, spiritually and materially, transpires to have been less the Duke himself than the abbot and his community of exiled monks from Saint-Évroult. As shown by Giuseppe Occhiato, of all the Hauteville foundations, it was the Abbey Church of Santa Eufemia that had the closest architectural links with the Norman homeland, more so than even Venosa and Mileto. Returning to Santa Eufemia's aforementioned foundation charter, we can see that the same was also true of its customs, which likewise point away from regional traditions and north towards the duchy whence its abbots and monks had emigrated. The original document is lost, probably due to the destruction of the monastery's archives and library by an earthquake in 1638, but its text survives in multiple copies which are considered authentic by their editor, Léon Robert Ménager. Close analysis of the Act's wording reveals some notable peculiarities. Amongst the most striking is a reference to Santa Eufemia as one of the churches under Robert Guiscard's monarchia, terminology which is unusual and without parallel in Robert Guiscard's extant diplomatic corpus, but which has close contemporary equivalents north of the Alps, for example, in the charters of Count Baldwin V of Flanders, and first and foremost in charters issued by the 11th century dukes of Normandy, Richard II, Robert I, and William II. The same is true of the Act's other idiosyncrasies that include the combination of a citation from Psalm 68 with the curse Anathema Maranatha in its Sanctio, which again is completely unique amongst Robert Guiscard's charters, but has verbatim parallels in the acts of Duke William II of Normandy and his predecessors. Perhaps most significant is the reference in the Foundation Charter's Intitulatio to Robert Guiscard as Gratia Dei Dux Apuliae, Calabriae, Siciliaeque, a titulature for which there is no corroborating evidence prior to 1082, when it first appears in some of Robert's other charters. For 20 years, Santa Eufemia's Foundation Charter thus remained the only one of Robert's charters to call him Gratia Dei Dux, and even afterwards, this particular titulature was rarely used and remained an exception compared to others, such as Divina Favente Clementia Dux, which is found in 36% of the charters issued between 1063 and 1085, and was used almost exclusively after the creation of the ducal chancery, an event which Horst Enzensberger dates to between 1079 and 1080. Prior to this, certainly during the early years of Robert's ducal tenure, most of his charters would have been prepared and drafted by the recipients, and the Foundation Charter for Santa Eufemia probably was no exception. The document's preparation by Abbot Robert of Santa Eufemia and his monks from Saint-Évroult would explain not only its peculiar use of monarchia and its idiosyncratic sanctio, both of which have direct parallels in the acts of Duke William II of Normandy, but are otherwise unattested for Robert Guiscard, but also its use of Gratia Dei Dux, which is found in no fewer than 9 charters issued by Duke William of Normandy before 1062, almost all of them for monastic communities in Normandy, founded and or patronized by him. These parallels leave, I believe, little doubt that Abbot Robert looked back to Normandy for suitable templates when drafting Santa Eufemia's Foundation Charter, more specifically to the monastic charters issued by his former lord and advocate, Duke William. We will recall that before his monastic career, Robert had served in the Norman Duke's entourage, a position in which he would have first witnessed and internalized Norman diplomatic custom before implementing it regularly as prior and then abbot of Saint-Évroult. Thanks to these appointments, Robert not only recognized the symbolic value of such custom, but he also knew how to export and replicate it hundreds of miles from home in southern Italy, thereby generating major cultural capital for his new monastery of Santa Eufemia. Having established a relationship between the acts of Duke William II of Normandy and Santa Eufemia's Foundation Charter, we can go further by identifying the exact source on which this charter was modeled. This source is none other than the Foundation Charter of Saint-Évroult, where Robert had been abbot prior to his deposition and exile. As with Santa Eufemia, the charter William II issued to Saint-Évroult upon its foundation around 1050 does not survive in the original, but the copies preserved in the monastery's 13th century cartulary are generally accepted as authentic, except for a spurious exemption clause that need not concern us here. Placing the text of the two foundation charters side by side not only shows beyond reasonable doubt that one served as the other's template, but it also resolves the idiosyncrasies discussed earlier. Robert Guiscard's designation as Gratia Dei Dux in the document from Santa Eufemia was adopted from William's titulature in the Saint-Évroult Charter, and even the unusual reference to Robert's rule in Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily as monarchia is an adaptation of the term regnum that is used to describe William's rule over Normandy. The two cartulary copies of Saint-Évroult's Foundation Charter represent two slightly different versions of the same act, the second one of which is dated 25th of September 1050 and supersedes the earlier, undated version, probably an unauthorized draft. This second and definitive version, which was then copied verbatim by Orderic in his Historia Ecclesiastica, not only gives Robert the Grand Mesnil pride of place amongst its witnesses, where he appears ahead of his brother Hugh, right after Duke William, the Archbishop of Rouen, and the bishops of Évreux and Lxxi, but it also credits him as the primary agent in the document's original production by referring to him as Robertus, huius cartulae auctor et factor. Having identified Robert as the person who, in 1050, had personally designed and written Saint-Évroux's foundation chart to manu propria in the name of his then Lord William of Normandy, there is no reason to doubt that he did so again 12 years later by producing an equivalent and in many respects identical charter for his new home of Santa Femia in the name of his new lord, Robert Guiscard. Though it was Robert Guiscard who supplied the economic capital by endowing the newly founded monastery of Santa Femia with lands and privileges, it was mainly Abbot Robert de Grandmesnil who gave the community its cultural capital by exporting Norman custom from Saint-Évroux to southern Italy. In Bourdieu's terminology, this was embodied cultural custom, a habitus that traveled with Robert and his fellow Norman emigrants and which was then institutionalized and exported further within southern Italy when members of the same emigrant community became abbots of Venosa and Mileto. Writing in the first quarter of the 12th century, Orderic could therefore claim that in these three Italian monasteries, the liturgy of Saint-Évroux is chanted in his tribus monasteris Italiae uticensis cantus canitur, and its customs remain alive to the present day. If Santa Femia was an important center for exporting Norman monastic custom into southern Italy in the second half of the 11th century, then the same could be, and indeed has been, said for the role played by Fécamp in importing this custom into Normandy in the first place and disseminating it within the duchy in the early 11th century, which brings me to my second case study. The 11th century revival and reform of Normandy's monastic landscape, following its depletion in the 9th and early 10th centuries, has traditionally been credited to the influence of an immigrant from Italy who, having left his native Italy for Burgundy to become a monk at Cluny and abbot of Dijon, was brought to Normandy by William the Conqueror's great-grandfather, Duke Richard II. I'm talking about William of Volpiano. In 1001, the Norman Duke called upon this William to transform the collegiate church which his father, Duke Richard I, had founded at Fécamp into a regular Benedictine monastery, which William did by assuming its abbacy and populating it with monks from Dijon. This was not the first such mission that William had accepted. By the time Duke Richard approached him, he held the abbacies of multiple monasteries that had all been refounded or reformed under his personal leadership, both within and without Burgundy, the most prominent of which include Metz, Toul, and Frutuaria. Having thus installed himself and his immigrant monks at Fécamp, William subsequently turned his hand to other monasteries founded by the Norman ducal family, which in scholarship has earned him a reputation as the father of Norman monasticism. Traditionally, this process has been seen as an extension of wider European reform movement, specifically that emanating from William's sometime home of Cluny. Though the important work of Neidhard Pulst, Véronique Gazot, Cassandra Potts and others has relativized this notion somewhat by rightly emphasizing the locally specific and distinct dynamics that underpinned this process in different parts of the Norman duchy, the prevalent view remains one in which so-called Cluniac custom provided the template both for Fécamp and disseminated further from there for Normandy's monastic reorganization during the early 11th century. This view hinges in no small part on the evidence of a charter issued to Fécamp by Duke Richard II, which states that after William's death, the custom consuetudo to be observed for the election and ordination of his successor and all future abbots of Fécamp shall be, and I quote, that which up to the present day is preserved at Cluny, the most distinguished of monasteries, Conobium Illustrissimum, whence the spring of holy monastic religion has since flown forth in various ways into regions far and wide. Richard II's Charter for Fécamp has long claimed a most distinguished position in Normandy's diplomatic corpus. Dated 30th of May 1006, it has been held up not just as one of the earliest extant documents from Fécamp's monastic archives that doubles as its refoundation charter, the foundation charter of the earlier collegiate church established in 990 only survives via a highly suspect 12th century copy, but also as the earliest ducal charter from Normandy to survive in the original. As I have demonstrated elsewhere, however, it is in fact a pseudo-original made in the later 11th century, probably the mid-1080s, a conclusion which has been adopted in Michael Bloch's recent reassessment of Fécamp's medieval Chartrier, published in 2021. Whilst large parts of the Charter's content are not suspect and were likely copied verbatim from the now lost original drawn up in 1006, one part that can be shown beyond reasonable doubt to constitute a late 11th century interpolation is none other than the reference to Cluny, previously cited as evidence for the import of its customs to Fécamp and thence throughout Normandy. Close examination of the extant document reveals that its lower half was re-ruled twice during the writing process. Originally, the parchment had been ruled uniformly on the reverse, as is normal for 11th century Norman ducal charters, so as to fit 23 lines with a spacing of 2.8 centimeters. As of line 19, this first pattern is superseded by a second that reduces the line spacing to 2.25 centimeters to accommodate 2 additional lines of text. This second pattern, in turn, gives way to a third 3 lines later, thereby reducing the spacing further to just 1.65 centimeters and adding yet another line. These revised patterns were both ruled on the obverse once most of the text had been copied, and the beginning and ending of the first re-ruling correspond exactly to the beginning and ending of the Cluny reference, with the second re-ruling following immediately thereafter. The most plausible explanation is that the Charter, as it survives today, had been prepared carefully to mimic the format and appearance of its early 11th century exemplar, from its dimensions and initial ruling pattern to its display script with dramatically elongated ascenders and descenders that closely imitates the kind of diplomatic minuscule written in Normandy during the early 11th century, but by the 1080s would have been viewed as anachronistic. In fact, we may go further by suggesting that this anachronism was a deliberate choice, serving strategically to evoke a sense of antiquity. Following this template meticulously, the copyist made generous use of the available writing space right up to the point at which he inserted the reference to Cluny's custom between the dispositio and the sanctio, probably after a rough calculation of the additional space required, which he then adjusted by recalculating and re-ruling the parchment for a second time. Without this interpolation, the dispositio and sanctio together comprise a total of 620 letters, which would have fitted neatly, in fact perfectly, into the document's original mise en page. Inserting 482 letters into this layout would have required 4 extra lines, but the Charter's dimensions, which, as suggested, may have been modeled on the exemplars, only allowed for 3. So the number of letters per line was increased by a quarter from 125 to 170 on average, thus minimizing the spaces between words and resulting in a sense of horizontal compression, which stands in stark contrast to the document's unmodified upper section. Further causes for suspicion concerning the charter's authenticity include, first, its chancery-type subscription by the hand of a certain Vido Notarius, a title or office which did not exist under Duke Richard II and is first recorded in charters issued several generations later by William II. Second, the fact that, unlike Duke Richard's other privileges, the witness names and crosses in the Fécamp Charter are not written by these individuals or their personal scribes, but rather uncharacteristically by the copyist of the main text. As well as, third, by the same copyist's abbreviation of the word signum with a double-crossed S, which is first found in another charter issued for Fécamp by Duke William II in 1059 and occurs with increasing regularity thereafter, but in all of the earlier ducal charters takes the shape of a single crossed S. Taken together, these and other features that cannot be discussed here reveal Fécamp's Cluniac exemption charter as, at best, a pseudo-original and, at worst, an outright forgery. Establishing a more precise date for the Charter's codification, and thus for the interpolation that interests us here, is a rather complex affair, but both its datable diplomatic characteristics and the historical context point strongly to the abbacy of William's late 11th century successor and namesake William II, under whose leadership Fécamp launched a concerted campaign of legal battles backed by several known forgeries to claim exemption from the power of Rouen Archbishop William Bona Anima. Appointed in 1079 by Duke William II after his tenure as abbot of the latter's foundation of Saint-Étienne-de-Caen, William Bona Anima had since tried repeatedly to exert his potestas over Fécamp, even physically forcing his way into the monastery on at least one occasion recorded by Fécamp's domestic chroniclers. By this point, Cluny's custom, and specifically its exemption, had become, in Bourdieu's terminology, institutionalized cultural capital that was recognized and imitated widely across the Latin West, especially in the age of the Gregorian papacy and the political climate of the investiture controversy. It thus made good sense for Abbot William II to associate Fécamp with this powerful Cluniac brand and evoke it in his conflicts with Rouen by interpolating one of the abbey's earliest and most important ducal charters in precisely the way we just saw. Back in 1006, by contrast, association with Cluny would have been mostly symbolic and carried relatively little political, economic, or legal currency in Normandy. Any cultural capital generated from it would have been in the form that Bourdieu calls embodied capital, the primary carriers of which are neither written documents nor pieces of formal legislation, but living individuals like William of Volpiano and his immigrant monks who had spent time at Cluny and brought some of its culture to Fécamp with their collective habitus, not dissimilar from the traditions carried from Saint-Évroult to Santa Femia by Robert de Grandmesnil and his followers half a century later. The corridors by which these individuals and the cultural capital they embodied traveled between Normandy and other areas of Norman influence in 11th century Europe were not one-way streets, however, but networks of mutual communication and exchange that facilitated the movement of people, goods, and habitus in both directions. We can see evidence of this in my third and final case study, which directs our view northwards from Normandy to England. In 1063, Duke William II of Normandy appointed the first abbot of Saint-Étienne-de-Caen, a Benedictine monastery he had founded just a few years earlier. William's choice for this prestigious position fell on Lanfranc, an Italian who had crossed the Alps, become a monk at the Norman Abbey of Lebec, and served as its prior for almost 2 decades. Having held the abbacy of Caen for 7 years, Lanfranc in 1070 was promoted once again, courtesy of his Lord William, who by that point had become King of England, and who now made Lanfranc the Archbishop of the kingdom's metropolitan see of Canterbury. Soon after his arrival in England, Lanfranc wrote to the then abbot of Lebec, Anselm, who in 1093 would succeed him as Archbishop, and demanded that some of his monks relocate to Canterbury. Some of these individuals had already accompanied Lanfranc to Caen, whereas others were to join him directly from Lebec. Those whose transferal the Archbishop requested in the early 1070s included a monk called Maurice, who had joined Lebec as a child oblate during Lanfranc's priorate and at the time of his relocation was still a teenager. Though Anselm complied with Lanfranc's request, he was far from pleased with it. Like Lanfranc, Anselm had known Maurice since his boyhood, and he had taught him Latin in Lebec's monastic school. In the letters Anselm wrote to Maurice following his departure, he refers to him as his personal favorite, his beloved son, whom he loved deeply and who loved him back in equal measure. Thus, when Lanfranc nominated Maurice amongst those whose presence he required at Canterbury, Anselm was devastated and in a letter addressed to Lanfranc, implored him not to separate him, quote, from the one who loved him more than anyone else and whom he loved more than anyone else. But to no avail. Over the following years, Anselm repeatedly wrote to Lanfranc asking for Maurice's return in words that reflect a genuine and increasing sense of desperation. But not until 1078 or so was Maurice finally allowed to cross the English Channel and return home via Lebec's dependent priory of Conflans-Sainte-Honorine. Bereft and heartbroken though he might have been, Anselm made the best of this period of separation by instructing Maurice to use his time at Canterbury to acquire valuable cultural capital for Lebec in the shape of knowledge and other resources. Few, if any, of the numerous letters he sent to Maurice between 1073 and 1078 missed the opportunity to combine declarations of love or friendship with some sort of pragmatic request or directive as to how Maurice could best avail himself of the rich cultural assets his temporary home had to offer. Anselm thus urged Maurice to continue his Latin lessons with Canterbury's famous schoolmaster and grammarian Arnulf of Beauvais, at the same time as encouraging him to read as many books as he could from Canterbury's well-stocked domestic library, especially pointing him to Virgil and other classical Latin authors which Maurice had not read under Anselm's own tutelage at Lebec and which were lacking from Lebec's monastic library. On more than one occasion, Anselm asked Maurice to produce copies of Canterbury Library volumes for Lebec, always insisting that his transcriptions should be so accurate as to be considered perfect, perfectus, and reminding Maurice that he preferred a faithful fraction of a text to an imperfect whole. On other occasions, he instructed Maurice to send Canterbury books to Lebec on interlibrary loan, with Lanfranc's permission, so they could be copied in-house, assuring both him and Lanfranc that he would return them promptly. The requested volumes included the Regularis Concordia, the aphorisms with Galen's gloss, a Libellus de Pulsibus, and Bedes de Temporibus, the latter of which, as Anselm explained to Maurice, was needed specifically to correct a bad copy of the same text kept in Lebec's library, a collection which was sizable in its own right and by the mid-12th century would become Normandy's richest monastic library with around 300 volumes. The books that Anselm obtained for Lebec via his Canterbury-based protégé were cultural capital in what Bourdieu calls the objectified state. And as such, they could travel and be exchanged physically in the same way as other kinds of goods or commodities. At the same time, though, Anselm strategically invested in embodied cultural capital when he encouraged Maurice to acquire knowledge by immersing himself fully in Canterbury's famous school and library, knowledge which Maurice would carry home with him upon his eventual return to Lebec, not physically, but mentally. Less tangible and more difficult to quantify than the books Maurice copied and or sent to Anselm from abroad, the knowledge he thus internalized whilst there generated just as much, if not more, cultural capital for his monastic community, especially in the long term. Sometime between 1136 and 1140, many years after his return from Canterbury, Maurice, by then in his 70s or early 80s, put the finishing touches to an autograph manuscript containing several authorial works. Besides three treatises on aspects of the monastic life, which previous scholarship, unaware of the author's identity, has credited to the so-called Anonymous Beckensis, one on the professions of monks, another on the professions of abbots, and one on the monastic liberty of Lxxi. These include 3 commentaries on the Gospel of Luke and some other texts no longer present in the manuscript today, but named on its original contents list. As I've shown elsewhere via a close codicological and paleographic analysis, Maurice almost certainly wrote these works after his return from England during the period between circa 1079 and 1140, when he lived first at Conflans and then from about 1093 back at Lübeck. Looking at the textual authorities referenced in Maurice's authorial works, however, especially those cited explicitly or implicitly in his 3 gospel commentaries, it transpires that a fair few of them were not available in Lübeck's later 11th and 12th century library. This is true especially of Roman authors such as Sallust, but also of patristic works by St. Ambrose, Gregory, and Leo, the Easter tables of Dionysius Exiguus, and Pope Gelasius' letters, all of which are cited frequently in Maurice's writings alongside more sporadic quotations from Arator, Cato, Cicero, Horace, Juvenal, Lucan, Ovid, Persius, Prosper, Prudentius, Sedulius, Statius, Terence, and others who were absent from Lübeck's book collection, but very much present, sometimes in multiple copies in Canterbury's well-stocked library. The fact that Maurice rarely quotes these authors verbatim, but more often than not uses paraphrases followed or preceded by vague references to their works, such as in Epistola ad Imperatorem, in Libro de Trinitate, or in Sermone quodam de Passione Domini, suggests that he did not have the relevant manuscripts in front of him, or at least no longer when writing at Conflans and Lübeck, but had read them some time ago and was now referencing them more or less from memory. At the most, he might have taken some notes whilst at Canterbury with first-hand access to its library, but as far as we know, he did not bring home any full copies. For several decades, therefore, this extensive cultural knowledge lived first and foremost within Maurice himself in the form of embodied cultural capital. And only towards the end of his life did he convert it into objectified cultural capital by producing a manuscript that was stored in Lübeck's monastic library and passed on to future generations. The case of Lübeck and Canterbury shows us the production and transmission of cultural capital between 2 monastic communities located within the Norman sphere of influence, not through unilateral import or export, but rather through the bilateral exchange first of people, then of goods in the shape of books, and finally, and perhaps most significantly, of cultural knowledge. The 3 case studies presented in this paper cannot claim to be exhaustive, of course, nor can they be accepted pars pro toto as representative of every Norman monastery in the period under consideration. That said, they do give us a good sense of the networks and cultural corridors that connected monastic communities in Normandy with those in other parts of Europe which came under Norman influence during the 11th century, specifically southern Italy and England. Scholars have long studied the exchange of both people and goods, including books, between these different yet connected Norman worlds based on tangible evidence such as texts, objects, and other sources that, in Bourdieu's terminology, can be considered objectified cultural capital. What I hope to have offered here, by contrast, is an exploration into the more intangible forms of cultural capital, especially in what Bourdieu calls its embodied format. Such capital was carried less by objects than by people, though, as we have seen in all 3 case studies, it could then be, and frequently was, converted into objectified forms such as charters, books, and other kinds of documents. Studying these sources in light of monastic custom and of the habitus of the people who produced and exchanged these documents allows us to ask new and, hopefully, insightful questions. Grazie.
Grazie professore per questi documentati
Thank you, Professor, for these documented exchanges of thoughts. Capital culture. So here we have 4 chairs waiting for the professors who gave their lectures today, starting from the opening lecture to the ones that came afterwards. If the professors are present, I kindly ask them to come here.
Ma interessante, professore, questi autori che lei ha elencato, no? Sì. Buongiorno, professore, sì, molto lieto di... È in arrivo anche Cantarella.
Professor Cantarella is coming, I think. Okay, let's start with the questions addressed to Professor Wickham. If you're willing to intervene, please raise your hand and go directly to Roberto.
Con timore e tremore.
Grazie, sono il primo. Excusez-moi, je vais parler en français.
Unfortunately, there is no translation from Italian to English.
Pardon, il faut beaucoup de concentration. Donc, je voudrais remercier Chris Wickham de sa très belle leçon inaugurale et qui m'a passionné, comme chacun d'entre nous. Et c'est une leçon marquée, cher Chris, du sceau de ta génialité que nous apprécions depuis, dans mon cas, plus de 30 ans, avec des vues panoramiques très convaincantes et très suggestives. Je pense qu'on n'aurait pas pu imaginer de meilleure introduction à notre semaine d'études. Je te remercie aussi d'avoir eu le fair play, mais tu es anglais, donc tu as du fair play, de me donner ton texte que j'ai entendu en italien, mais que j'ai pu relire aussi et méditer. J'ai également entendu Étienne Doublot avec un grand intérêt, et je vous remercie tous les deux de m'avoir cité au passage, parce que ça va me permettre de proposer une ou deux mises au point. Donc, Étienne Doublier m'attribue très aimablement l'expression de révélation féodale. Alors, je voudrais vous faire une révélation sur cette révélation féodale, c'est que l'expression est de Georges Duby. C'est-à-dire que c'est Georges Duby lui-même qui, en 1978, était pris de doute à propos du modèle de la révolution féodale. Alors, ensuite, il n'a pas voulu persister dans ce doute, mais enfin, les problèmes qui se posaient à ce sujet, il les percevait avec son flair. Moi, j'aurais tendance plutôt, en lecteur de Bourdieu, comme vous l'êtes tous, à proposer reproduction féodale pour un certain nombre de textes, pour les dossiers qui sont habituellement versés au bénéfice du changement de la rupture de l'an 1000. Alors, sur ce qu'a dit Chris Wickham, je pense que nous pouvons reprendre une discussion que nous avons commencée il y a au moins 25 ans. Ici, il y avait aussi Glauco Cantarella au colloque de Spoleto, à la semaine de Spoleto de 1979. Évidemment, nous avons pu évoluer l'un et l'autre, mais en gros, nous repartons un petit peu des mêmes bases. Nous avons des préoccupations communes, mais peut-être avec des accents un petit peu différents. J'admire beaucoup ta manière de faire des vues panoramiques et de construire des modèles. Moi, je suis peut-être un petit peu plus habité par le double sentiment que nous avons très peu de sources et qu'elles sont difficiles à comprendre, et aussi que les historiens modernes, et à toute époque depuis le XVIIe siècle, sont amenés à faire à leur sujet un certain nombre d'erreurs, un certain nombre de fausses manœuvres, et pas forcément moins ceux de la génération actuelle que ceux du XVIIe siècle, mais évidemment d'autres fausses manœuvres. Et donc, merci de citer que j'ai critiqué la thèse de la mutation de l'an 1000, mais je pense avoir encore plus et plutôt relevé certaines mauvaises lectures ou proposé d'autres lectures des dossiers et relever un usage discutable des sources. Nos dossiers, mais ce sont des dossiers français, étant ce qu'ils sont, et notamment le plus beau d'entre eux, le Conventum Hugonis, auquel tu as fait allusion, la lecture serait là, me semble-t-il, en faveur de la reproduction féodale, car la situation et le type de séquence paraissent très proches de ce que sous d'autres angles d'attaque laissait entrevoir 100 ans plus tôt la vie de Géraud d'Aurillac, que tu as cité, et les annales de Flodoard. Et donc, ce que je préconise et que j'accepte évidemment, je demande d'entendre débattu, ce serait plutôt de substituer à la révolution ou mutation de l'an 1000 deux mutations. Une mutation féodale en amont, donc celle de l'an 900, et une gerbe de mutation au cours de l'an 1100, dans laquelle notamment l'essor des villes jouerait un rôle important, et avec un certain nombre de mutations associées que nous ne savons pas forcément articuler parfaitement. Alors tu as parlé de Florian Mazel et tu as dit une révolution grégorienne, pourquoi pas? Bon, on peut tous être d'accord. Mais dans l'ensemble, puisque tu refuses l'hégémonie de l'Église sur les rapports sociaux, je pense que tu ne te rallies pas aux vues de Florian Mazel, dont je précise que là aussi, elle repose, à mon avis, sur une mauvaise lecture des sources et sur quelques erreurs de méthodologie. Pas tout à fait les mêmes que la mutation de l'an 1000, mais tout de même des choses qu'on peut discuter d'une manière tout à fait frontale. J'en prends l'exemple de la notice de Georges, dans laquelle Patrick Henriet et moi-même, qui l'avons consulté, étudié indépendamment l'un de l'autre, nous avons proposé une autre lecture. C'est-à-dire que nous ne croyons pas à la rupture de l'amicitia, mais plutôt, avec cette notice et la gerbe d'autres sources, nous croyons au maintien de l'amicitia entre les nobles et les monastères, ce qui permet d'ailleurs d'avaler un peu, d'amortir le choc de la réforme grégorienne. Donc, sur ce point, nous serions, me semble-t-il, en faveur de la non-rupture. Mais enfin, en ce qui te concerne, cher Chris, accepterais-tu, pour les pays post-carolingiens, qui ne sont évidemment pas toute l'Europe,
professor,
oui, qui ne sont
necessary.
Accepterais-tu une chronologie en deux temps, avec un premier moment de rupture importante vers 900, un deuxième vers 1100, ce qui correspond d'ailleurs en gros à la chronologie de l'Incastellamento par Pierre Toubert et à ce que disent les spécialistes de l'encellulement, avec évidemment de nombreuses variations régionales, plus ou moins détectables pour nous, vu la rareté des sources. Pardon d'avoir été long, mais ce sont évidemment des problèmes importants et dont nous pourrons longuement discuter si tu le
Grazie. Siamo dolorosi.
Thank you very much. We are obliged to have short questions on a precise topic. We do not have so much time available.
Pour ces comments très intéressants, comme toujours. Et je dois dire que je suis 90%, 95% d'accord avec toi. qu'il y a un grand changement en France, surtout en France vers l'an 900. Je suis tout à fait d'accord. Dans le reste de l'Europe, on s'en va très bien. Moi-même, j'ai parlé d'un long 11e siècle. Je suis bien content de parler d'un changement qui dure plus d'un siècle. Aussi parce que ça dépend des régions. Et ceci m'apparaît fondamental, que les grands changements ont lieu dans les régions différentes, à des moments différents. Et cela, je crois, absolument crucial. Sur la réforme, je sais bien qu'il y a bien des antécédents, des grandes luttes de la fin de l'XIe siècle. Évidemment, on a parlé de ces choses depuis le IVe siècle. Mais qu'il y a quelque chose qui ne marche plus entre plusieurs gens de l'Église à la fin de l'XIe siècle m'apparaît assez clair. Donc, moi-même, j'ai l'idée que parler de révolution ne veut pas penser toujours de la Révolution française. On peut utiliser la parole dans un sens beaucoup plus large, et je suis bien content de le faire. Il y a des grands changements. Et après ça, il y a des grands changements. Et après ça, on peut utiliser les paroles qu'on veut choisir. Et j'ai bien choisi la parole révolution et je suis content de le faire. Mais à part ça, je ne suis pas en désaccord avec toi. Mais l'autre chose, j'insisterai un peu plus que tu insistes, je crois, sur l'effet que la seigneurialisation a sur les paysans. Quand j'ai relu il y a 2 mois ton texte sur les prélèvements seigneuriaux en Vendôme, j'ai pensé, ici, assurément, il manque des sources. Et on ne peut pas être absolument sûr que les paysans payent vraiment plus au Seigneur qu'auparavant. Mais je crois que oui, et je crois que tu penses aussi qu'ils payent de plus. Et cela m'apparaît important. Et pour cela, je pense qu'il y a des grands changements pour les paysans, que sont la grande majorité des gens en Europe. Et aussi, pour ça, je reste content de penser dans la terminologie révolutionnaire. Mais il s'agit d'un jeu de paroles, enfin.
Professor Wickham, congratulations for your lecture. I was astonished by the fact that there's a lack of archaeological sources testifying the rich trade and exchange of goods, gold, and so on and so forth. I believe, and my question is, do you share that the presence in the Mediterranean area of a common currency, having some scenographic symbols in Arabic language, starting from the 10th century until the 12th century. For example, the Taridi in Salerno, in particular, Guaimario, and then the Armustansir. Then there will be the Bizante of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, Bizante, in Arabic letters with Latin symbols, all golden coins. And I think that this is testifying also from an archaeological point of view the similarity of many different between many different words. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comment. The fact of the southern Italy is an important fact. I didn't say that archaeology is not saying so much on these exchanges, and in fact, in the Mediterranean context, it is saying so much. So we could spend 1 hour discussing about it, but I won't do it. I will not, I promise. However, exchanges of ceramics are well known, and we also discuss about it. I discuss about it elsewhere. However, there are some differences. There are more exchanges, and I'm focusing on the 11th century, more international exchanges in the south of the Mediterranean rather than in the north. However, we also have some exchanges in the north. In the northern Italy, the exchanges are at the coastal level. Then Pisa, Venice, well, this will not surprise that there are some archaeological sources of exchanges there as well. However, we have less exchanges in the Italian hinterland. In the south, in the area of Otranto, in the Apulia region, the exchanges with the Byzantine world, well, they go on. Amalfi and Salerno, there as well, there's a clear archaeology where we have these exchanges. And also, this gives a context to the element of the coin. And you're right, the fact that Amalfi and Salerno are using versions of the Sicilian coin or currency also when the Islamic Sicily is not there, and this is significant. I would like to know whether or not the same things happens in the hinterland there. I know that coins may move much more easily than some other goods. However, the fact is that these are indications. These are important signs of a certain level of exchanges, and I completely agree with you on this. Thank you very much. I apologize for intervening what Professor Wickham was saying. Coins, yes, they move. And the example I gave before of the treasure found during the archaeological excavations, well, gold coins were traveling from this basin, going through Spain to Luni. So the fact that we found a treasure of, I think, 21 coins is one thing, but normally they were spent. Gold was spent and invested for building things. And the Spanish gold was giving so many profits. This is one case, however, we found these treasures. So money was traveling, and sometimes, not always, it was invested. I have a question for Chris Wickham. Could you better explain what you mentioned in the final part of your lecture about the link between transformation and revolution? Because you discussed about transformation or signal revolution as a basis for the ecclesiastical revolution. Could you better identify what you're thinking of when discussing about this formalization? Well, what I'm thinking of, I was brief because, of course, we could discuss forever about this, even more than 1 hour, without going to the core. Well, it's complicated. However, when I see in the 12th century some disputes on the reverencia in Italy, I studied these disputes between churches, pretending to be the patrons of the churches. Normally they're monasteries, but these are disputes between monasteries where the monastery wants to control a chapel, for instance. And here I found that there are groups of peasants testifying, having a clear idea of the precise meaning of each aspect of the local ritual. And they perfectly know that it is important to go to the main mass for the main patron of the monastery. Well, this is all about. They know very good the meaning of each sign of the ritual. I cannot see that before the changes occurred in the 11th century. These are things related to the 12th century. These are quite new things. There's a more formalized meaning of the local nature of the ritual. And I see, at the same time, some situations where a local senior lord owning a local church and is happy about saying, okay, I'm not owing that church anymore. I keep my patronatus, but I'm not the owner of this. Why shouldn't I be that? So there's an awareness also among local people who are not involved in the debates at the end of the 11th century that there is something here that is not good, not anymore. They have a formalized meaning of the nature of the ritual, and this is what I mean by formalization, and the way this can allow for some aspects of the ritual practices and ecclesiastical practices not to work anymore. The Lord perfectly knows that he can continue to control the church because, of course, he's the master, so to say, the patron. So the power is not changing, the way this is formalized changes. Well, maybe we can now move to the next speaker. So, any questions for the next speaker, for Professor Doublier?
Allora possiamo passare alla lezione.
So we can move to the lecture given by Professor Cantarella. I don't know, maybe some Spanish people want to intervene. Unfortunately, there's no translation from French into English.
Très indiqué, je vais essayer de parler lentement. D'abord, je voudrais remercier le professeur Cantarella parce que je crois que c'est important d'avoir sur l'Espagne, qui a une historiographie tout à fait particulière, tout à fait propre, avec des problématiques qui lui sont propres, et que c'est toujours très important d'avoir le regard des chercheurs non hispaniques, qu'ils soient français, anglo-saxons, italiens plus rarement, etc. Et j'ai trouvé assez admirable la façon dont il a démêlé et utilisé toute la complexité, en particulier la complexité politique et territoriale de l'Espagne de cette époque. Je voudrais juste ajouter un point, mais sur lequel je ne crois pas du tout qu'on soit en désaccord. Je pense que je me place plutôt dans la dernière partie de ton intervention. Je pense que les changements d'ordre culturel, au-delà de la simple liturgie, les changements culturels introduits par les moines, disons, ultra-pyrénéens, clunisiens et autres, et les clercs, en péninsule ibérique à ce moment-là, sont vraiment extrêmement importants et intéressants, même dans la perspective d'une discussion qui était aussi celle qu'on avait avec Chris Wickham sur la révolution ou évolution dans l'Église. Je pense par exemple au fait que avant l'arrivée de ces moines, il n'y a pratiquement pas de liturgie funéraire en péninsule ibérique, Catalogne exceptée, comparable à celle qu'on a à Cluny et au nord des Pyrénées. On n'a pas de nécrologe, on n'a pas de prière, enfin, il y a des prières générales pour les morts, mais on n'a pas du tout la spécialisation dans la prière pour les morts qu'on a. Et d'un coup, subitement, brutalement, on la voit arriver en péninsule ibérique, avec les premiers nécrologes, par exemple, qui sont tous faits par et pour des clercs qui viennent du nord des Pyrénées. Dans le domaine de la géographie, ce serait exactement la même chose. On commence à rédiger un type de texte qu'on n'avait jamais fait pendant des siècles en péninsule. Et ça me paraît important parce que ce sont des éléments qui... On peut dire, si on veut, que ça va dans le sens d'une réforme, mais ça n'a à peu près, à mon avis, rien à voir avec la réforme dite grégorienne, ça n'a rien à voir avec la papauté. Ce sont des évolutions qui permettent de rejoindre d'autres évolutions qui, au nord des Pyrénées, ont eu lieu depuis des siècles. Et donc, ça nous amène, à mon avis, forcément, à réfléchir un petit peu sur cette notion de changement et de rapport avec les luttes qui se font au sommet de l'Église avec différents souverains et qui, là, n'ont rien à voir. Voilà, donc c'est simplement pour insister un petit peu sur ce point, mais encore une fois, merci, Glauco.
Bon.
Bon, Patrick, avant tout, je remercie bien parce que je te remercie. Je te remercie pour ce que tu as dit de ma relation, de mon intervention, ce que tu dis de l'importance de la historiographie contemporaine, ibérique. Il m'a fait penser au dernier livre, un livre récemment publié par Giuseppe Fornasari, qui a comme sous-titre La fine di una stagione, la fin d'une saison. Et je lui ai demandé qu'est-ce que ça signifie. Il me dit, c'est la fin de ma saison parce que je suis vieux. Je dis, bon, d'accord. Mais c'est aussi la fin d'une saison, à mon avis, où l'historiographie était toute menée sur l'Europe franco-italo-allemande. Il faut prendre attention à ces nouveaux mondes qui sont en train de se développer, où on discute beaucoup, parce que ce sont les nouveaux mondes. Et nous ne pouvons pas rester bloqués, rester ici. Et bon, ce que tu dis de moine, oui, est très intéressant, je ne savais pas, j'en savais rien, je l'avoue. Mais il est vrai que et précisément les Espagnols, les Ibériques, hein, précisément les Ibériques, ont cette conscience quand ils parlent de la réforme en Santiago, en Saint-Jacques-de-Compostelle, sur la réforme romano-cluniacense, non? Parce que les Clunisiens, oui, et en effet, les Clunisiens en Galice ont été très importants pas seulement jusqu'à la première vingtaine du siècle XII, comme tu sais, non? Avec Ponce de Mergueil, mais aussi après. Il y a nous avons les recherches de Francesco Renzi sur les moines cisterciennes en Galice, et on voit par là que les Clunisiennes ont maintenu une sorte d'hégémonie, même face aux cisterciens, ce qui n'était pas facile, jusqu'au début du XIIIe siècle. Et bon, il est presque normal que les rituels funéraires, je ne dirais pas clunisiens, mais de type clunisien, c'est diffusé. C'est diffusé. Il y a juste une chose que parfois, même si je suis presque moine clunisien, que parfois j'oublie, c'est une chose qui avait dit le feu Giorgio Picasso, il y a 20 ans, non, plus que 20 ans, il avait dit « Que savons-nous des usages clunisiennes dans le monastère clunisien ?» Parce que nous savons des usages clunisiens, tu recordes, Giuseppe? Parce que nous savons des usages clunisiens à Cluny, et donc l'abbaye la plus grande, la plus importante, mais dans les prieurés, que savons-nous des usages clunisiens? Je crois que tu as donné une trace qu'il faut étudier et poursuivre. Heureusement, on a beaucoup de jeunes qui ont cette male idée d'étudier l'histoire médiévale et de faire des recherches d'histoire médiévale. C'est à eux. Ma saison aussi a terminé. Et merci encore.
Prego, professore.
Please, Professor. I had no time for asking a question to Etienne. A beautiful lecture stressing the differences at the regional level that convinced me a lot. However, I'm wondering about the diversity in terms of authority that the German emperors have. This is different from the other European kings, I think. The French kings are weaker, okay, fine, but the English and Castilian kings stress these authority in a different way, isn't it? I know it's a difficult question because it requires a lot of study, and I didn't do it. However, my question is, what do you think about it? Are there any differences, main differences? Well, thank you very much for this question. To be honest, I do not think I have the sufficient knowledge on the Iberic context to be able to follow this debate. I could mention one brief article, convincing article by Timothy Reuter on Germany, the Sonntagbeck, the German way in history, where we remark what you were detecting. I mean, some basic different conditions where the king basically is like someone guaranteeing one order. And we know what this is all about. We know the history, and this function exalts itself in the 10th century. So the 11th century is the century where this dimension, which is strongly dominating and not that governing of this authority, reaches an apex, but at the same time knows and trespassing for the effect of inclusions due to some debates, not just ecclesiological, but also investing the authority of the king. This is why there's this takeoff of the 12th century with the rediscovery of the land, which is a rediscovery of new lands with a new approach towards the land in a general process of re-territorialization that you detected yourself, but that is not coming from the king, not at all. Thank you very much. You're welcome. I also have one question for you. In Italy, we would say the Pierino's question. I mean, the question of somebody who didn't study this topic. My impression is, I don't know if this is right or wrong, it has to do with the sacralization of the power, which is a big topic. And I think that the more we go up with emperors, kings, and the more we make efforts and continuously we say that the real nature of legitimacy is there, because this is holy. When we go to the bottom, to the lower ranks, so to say, we are much more silent, so to say. We are not looking for these pretexts. And however, I don't know if this is how it is. Well, this is a question not to be that serious. It is difficult to give an answer because the possibility of communicating our self-conception of attributing functions is different from the position in the on the social ladder. So, as I wanted to express with the metaphor of the mirror at the beginning, there are many more possibilities. So not only with a self-consciousness from a holy point of view, but also for a plurality of people, communities, actors to give functions and also a legitimacy based on these sacred contexts. And this is shown in so many testified texts that we do not have in different levels. It is a question to which it is difficult to give an answer. However, the 11th century is a turning point for the immersion on these context of some new actors who were silent before, sometimes ignored, relatively silent and ignored. Thank you very much. May I add one thing? Another Pierino's question. You have to raise your voice a bit. The Castilian, well, of course, I have no more voice. I spoke too much. However, as Etienne was saying, those people writing say the king is holy. Well, they're always clerics, and of course they want to please the king and the emperor. They are clerics, and so they're clergymen, and this is why they write in these terms. Another thing, when you talk about sacralization, probably, I didn't invent that, probably we should distinguish between two types of sacralizations. What we have more or less until the beginning of the 12th century, and then that sacralization that we have included in the creeds, so to say, of the Roman law. These are two different things. So this is just my answer. Well, you are less Pierino, so to say, than me, so your question was not that silly.
Se abbiamo finito, possono essere interventi. Ah, ho capito. A di volte qui abbiamo fatto interferenze, no? Ma sai com'è.
He has a question.
Just to I think that to back on this question a bit, the question of sanctity and perceived sanctity, I think, and I think Germany is quite important for that in the 11th century, because it is, after all, it is performative sanctity that you see at the level of emperors, that you see at the level of kings, and this sanctity is only really then efficient when it is performed and imitated, and I think that goes down right to the bottom. We don't always see it in the sources, but you can see it at the very least at the level of dukes. You can see it at the level of the local aristocracy. And you can even, and this brings me back a bit to what we discussed earlier, you can see this in very local, even rural rituals, church processions. You can see this in hagiography. So I think there is a tendency to look to the top for sanctity, but we need to be aware that this sanctity trickles down and is imitated at large by the lower strata. I mean, I don't know if this is...
Yeah, I think also so, but probably more sacrality than sanctity.
Yeah.
Qualche intervento?
Any questions or remarks on the lecture by Professor Paul? One? Yes, we have one? Yes. I have a question for Professor Cantarella about your very interesting lecture. I know nothing about Spain. So you spoke about golden rain, quintals of gold as a proof of economic development, economic success, if I have well understood. So the issue about gold in the 9th and 10th century is a very complicated issue, because normally, usually in ancient times, gold is an indicator of economic crisis. And as a proof of that, there is the fact that probably in southern Italy, the Byzantine coins is mentioned in the sources several times, but there is just one sample in the treasure of Ordona. If we consider the sources which mention a huge amount of golden coin, well, we should find higher quantities. And so maybe, well, I don't know the sources, but maybe, in my opinion, it is just a recording of goods rather than actual coin. And the proof of this is the treasure you mentioned, the treasure of Cluny, which, if I recall correctly, should date back 1130, 1131, more or less. And it is the proof that Cluny had its revenue in Spain, which was paid in golden coin, but also silver coin. And in my opinion, based on my limited knowledge, an indicator of the economic development of Spain is the participation of Spain in the Carolingian system, based on which there are silver coins, so not very precious, and so a currency which is more aimed at the exchange, commercial exchange. Well, thank you. Roberto Arelli will say something, because we were talking about the lecture by Paul. As far as I know, in Spain, well, the Spanish scholars, but not only Spanish scholars, never studied a monetary history like the one which Carlo Maio Cipolla did several decades ago. And for Spain, this is not the case. And so we can find something, but maybe they talk about a silver coin as something coming from heaven. So there is no specific research on this, as far as I know. The treasure of Cluny, of course, I didn't say that, but why? 1126, 1131. Well, the sources tell us that after the death of Alfonso VI, the gold of Spain had finished. And in Cluny, something was paid in silver coin. The fact that we found this treasure, so 1126, 1131, means that it was hidden. But we have to remember what happened in Cluny in 1126, the invasion of the abbey. Basmega went back, and so there was the siege of the abbey. And we might also think that some monks, to prevent the gold from being stolen by the soldiers or the papal legates, that really loved wealth and wanting to steal everything. So probably this money was hidden, and it came out as archaeological ruins. So I understand what you say. The Byzante is a nominal currency. Yes, it's right. But in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, gold was circulating. So the calculation I made of 3.5 quintals was due to the fact that Cluny collected 5,000 milkers per year for some years, and then 10,000 per year. And when, after the first defeat of Alfonso VI in Zalaca, for 5 years, he didn't pay what was called census in Cluny, and so Abbot Hugo went there and he asked for all the money, all the gold which had not been given until that moment. Then that gold was circulating because before reaching Cluny, it went through Semperini, Colonna de los Andes, which was a kind of ATM. And so also the head of Saint-Jacques passed from there. When Maurizio Bordino, the second, third, head, which was brought to the Holy Land. So gold was there. Gold used to circulate. That's why I spoke about addicted economy, because 72 years ago, used to say that the gold in Spain was higher than all the revenues of the seigneurial complex of Cluny, and with that gold, a lot had been founded, but that gold was there. The Spanish kings took that gold, used that gold. And the fact that we don't have archaeological remains, this is something else, but gold was there. And as we know, Fletcher was one of the first ones to say that the gold dust came from Senegal. So Africans in Senegal contributed to build Cluny III, which was beaten by the revolutionaries.
Of Benjamin Poe. I like the idea. I like the way that you play with Bourdieu. That you created the personalized version of cultural capital. I thought that was neat. And the Normans are transnational, and that's a striking feature of them. And although one can certainly say that the structures of the kingdom of Sicily are not at all the same as the structures of the Duchy of Normandy and so on. People do move. But do you think the Normans are special here? Other people move. Do they move in a different way?
I deliberately try to stay clear of the idea of exceptionalism with this. I think what makes the Normans, or what made, I should hope, the Normans a particularly good case study for this particular argument is that in the 11th century in particular, it is just one of, if we want to use the term people, one of the people that really do travel very widely in sort of concerted ways, both north and south, and then of course also further east. But I think the corridors through which they move are neither special nor unique. Right. These are corridors and the kind of the means, the vehicles by which this capital is generated. Not least through human travel, not least to people actually going the distance personally or in groups. This is, of course, no different from what we see at the very end of the 11th century with the Crusade movement, for example. This is no different from what we have seen from the early 11th century or even from the very late 10th century with exchanges between, say, England and Flanders. So they're very, very similar corridors, very similar dynamics going on. But I think makes the Normans, if not unique, at least special and worthy of dedicated study in that particular context is that there are these very traceable communications going on back and forth and over prolonged periods of time, several generations at the very least, between the homeland and the new territories that come under Norman influence. And that's something that you don't always see at large in quite the same way, I think.
Okay, thanks.
C'è ancora una richiesta, mi pare.
We have another question, maybe. Roberto? For Professor Paul. Let's be brief, okay? So, you mentioned Sylvester II and his knowledge. Special knowledge. He loved mathematics, astrology, etc. I believe that it isn't only a matter of Norman world roots of the 11th century, because also the 10th century. There is a nice book entitled The Century with No Name by Sismel. So this book shows that in the 10th century, Sylvester II, before becoming Sylvester II, and other prelates had some reference points and moved in order to exchange written materials and Latin sources that you mentioned in your lecture, very interesting lecture. Thank you.
I can be very brief and affirmative. Thank you very much, and you're absolutely right. In fact, you don't even have to stop at the 10th century. You can go right back into Merovingian, at the very least times. Even if you look at people like Bede in early medieval England, we know that Bede was brought books personally from Italy by his abbots, sort of nuncios. So basically, these exchanges and this portable knowledge, both through people and, of course, through objects produced by people, that is in no way an invention of the 11th century. And I hope I did not give that impression either. I think the 11th century, for reasons mentioned in response to Chris's question, just makes for a particularly neat case study, because we have sources that we very rarely get, say, from the 8th, 9th, and even from the 10th century. So the 11th century has this sort of almost mushrooming of evidence in ways that makes it both easier and more fascinating, I guess, to look into the 11th century as a sort of case in point, without having to claim that none of this existed earlier or ceased existing at the year 1100, which of course it didn't either. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Abbiamo spazio per una domanda.
We have time for one more question or two if we want to survive.
Okay. And a lot of this, when you were talking about Beck and Canterbury, very interesting, and highlighting the newness of these foundations in Normandy. And of course, so you then get this pull in of Italian clerics and then on into England, back and forth. And I was surprised too by some of the very basic poetic texts missing at Beck, Christian poetic texts, forget about Virgil. But what I wondered too does something happen in the Edward the Confessor's reign? He has very close relationships with Jean Fécamp. Or is it part of conquest to do this? Or does it happen in a softer way before the conquest?
That's a great question, thank you. I think the conquest, as in the English conquest or the Norman conquest of England, the Norman conquest of England,
1066,
and all that. It certainly acts as a catalyst. I'm not sure it acts as a game changer. The interesting thing also for the dynamic between Le Bec-et-Loing and Canterbury is that it is actually not necessarily a two-party relationship. This is triangulated quite regularly through places like, first of all, through Caen, even through Mont Saint-Michel into the 12th century. So there's, I think, but it is based on precedent that you can find in Edward the Confessor's reign, because we know that, this is getting very difficult, we know that cross-channel exchange of people and knowledge preceded 1066 by quite some time. But I do think you have a point there, that the soft exchange, as opposed to the sort of the hard exchange by people who are actually brought over and almost planted strategically. And I think, the Lanfranc example is actually very, very potent there, because he is, of course, the highest ranking, York apart, but the highest ranking churchman all of a sudden in post-conquest England. And he makes these demands, and he knows particularly whom he wants to bring over and why. Right? So this is a power play that is exercised at an archiepiscopal level. Whereas, of course, what William the Conqueror does pre-conquest is he does this at a ducal level and then continues to do so at a royal level across the channel. So I think, yes, there is a difference there, but again, it's more a difference of perhaps why rather than how. Because these channels, they do exist, they're just exploited differently as a result of 1066.
Ci sono ardenti suppliche.
There are several requests to conclude. We cannot reject these requests. So see you tomorrow morning.
Professore, le chiedo scusa. Sì. Luca. Grazie. Gli interventi che hai fatto.